Hey guys, tonight we begin with something warm, soft, and possibly laced with poison. So, get comfortable. Maybe grab a blanket, dim the lights, and imagine the comforting smell of freshly baked bread. Except, if we were in Victorian England, that smell might come with a side of arsenic, chalk, and the occasional dash of ground-up alum. Because, of course it did. This is 19th century Britain, where progress was booming. Regulation was a myth, and health and safety were optional hobbies. Now, bread, humble, simple bread, was the lifeblood of Victorian diets. The working poor lived on it. Literally, an entire family could survive on loaves and tea 4 days. But there was a catch, and it was, predictably, deadly. See, bakers in the mid-19th century were stuck in a strange triangle. Greedy mill owners, impossible demands from customers who wanted white bread at pauper prices, and no real rules about what was allowed in food. White bread wasn't just bread, it was a status symbol, a soft brag that said, "I'm not poor. I can afford flour that looks angelic and white." Unfortunately, most people couldn't afford it, and bakers, ever enterprising, found creative ways to make it happen. Enter the first villain of the night. Alum. It's a salt compound. Technically harmless, in small doses, but Victorian bakers dumped it into dough like confetti. Alum made coarse, brown flour look white and fine like magic, except the magic was digestive misery. Alum hardened the bread, made it harder to digest, and, in enough quantity, basically turned your intestines into one long, cramping protest march. Still, nobody really complained. Bread was bread. People were more worried about affording it than surviving it. And the bakers, many didn't even know what all these additives did. They were following tricks passed down in the trade. Half myth, half recipe, because back then, most apprentices weren't chemists. They were kids pulling 16-hour shifts next to scalding ovens, fighting flour dust and sleep deprivation. Let's pause on that image. A 17-year-old in a flour-covered apron, eyes red from heat, tossing powdered alum into a mixing bowl at 4 a.m. Because, yes, the Victorian baker's life wasn't just chemically tragic. It was physically brutal. Bakers often woke at midnight, started kneading at 1, baked through dawn, and delivered by sunrise. By the time London's clerks were yawning their way into offices, bakers had already inhaled enough flour dust to coat their lungs white for life. And that's before things got toxic. You see, sometime around the 1830s, economics decided to make things worse, as it usually did. Millers realized they could make more money by adulterating flour right at the source. Flour came mixed with plaster of Paris, chalk, or ground rice. Because, again, white was fashionable. Brown looked dirty, and no one wanted to look poor, even if it meant slowly poisoning yourself. Bread became a silent scandal. Victorians joked that London bakers could produce more calcium than cows. And somewhere in a dingy back room, a baker tried to hide the grayish tint of low-quality flour with something even more suspicious. Arsenic. Let's sit with that for a second. Arsenic. A well-known poison, used in rat traps, pigments, and, apparently, pastries. One popular culprit was something called Scheele's green, a bright green compound made with copper and arsenic. It was used to tint decorative ornaments, wallpaper, and occasionally food coloring. Because a green bun looked healthy, right? There's a whole, absurdly tragic logic to this. The baker didn't necessarily mean asterisk to poison you. He just wanted your buns to glow in the shop window like emeralds. It was marketing. Deadly? Yes, but visually appealing. And the funnest awful thing, this wasn't even illegal yet. The first real food safety law, the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act, didn't show up until 1860. And even then, enforcement was about as rigid as stale dough. Few inspectors, fewer prosecutions. Until then, bakers essentially worked in a wild west of flour factories. If you're repicturing some Dickensian bakery with a soot-black ceiling and a sweating man kneading dough in silence, you're not wrong. That's the scene only. Replace clean with questionably lethal. And think about this. Every single loaf had a backstory. Every loaf was a little experiment. What would whiten it, soften it, make it rise higher, or mask a bad batch? Flour bleached with alum. Dough softened with potatoes or ground beans. Sometimes sawdust. Because who doesn't love a crunchy texture? The tragedy is that bakers didn't have it easy either. They were caught between customer demands and survival. If your neighbor's bread looked whiter, you'd lose business. So, in went the alum. And if the flour was already adulterated before arriving, you had no choice but to keep baking. Bread wasn't just poisoned. The asterisk industry asterisk was. Then came the baker's lung. That gentle Victorian euphemism for chronic occupational asthma, because hours of flour dust turned lungs into filters. Many bakers, still teenagers, coughed up chalky mucus by 20 and died before 50. And yet, they were considered lucky, stable trade, stable food, warm ovens in winter. It was asterisk respectable death by dough. Asterisk, now imagine walking into a Victorian bakery in 1850. The windows foggy, the air thick with starch and heat, loaves stacked high, golden and perfect looking, but inside riddled with chemicals. You'd probably smile, hand over your penny, and congratulate yourself for a fine breakfast, and your stomach, dutifully Victorian, would thank you with cramps. Let's float over now to the moment when people started noticing they were being slowly poisoned. Because that took decades. It wasn't obvious right away. Bread was cheap and filling, so nobody wanted to question it. But by the 1850s, medical reports began muttering about chronic intestinal afflictions in the working classes. Basically, too many people were ill, too often, and doctors were starting to connect dots. Bread was one of them. One particular moment made headlines. The 1855 Bradford sweet poisoning. It wasn't technically bakers this time. It was a confectioner's blunder, but it revealed just how deadly the laissez-faire system had become. A candy maker accidentally used arsenic instead of sugar. 21 people died. Over 200 were poisoned. Entire families collapsed after eating The public freaked out justifiably, and the government reluctantly agreed that maybe, just asterisk maybe, asterisk anyone selling food should at least know what was in it. Still, bakers grumbled about the new interference, because habit dies hard, and so did some. By the late 1800s, the great white bread crisis was fading, but not gone. Health reformers, chemists, and food writers popped up like crusty moralists, preaching purity in flour, and for the first time, people started romanticizing brown bread again. It was honest, natural, and untainted. Though, of course, half the rich who praised it still secretly preferred the white stuff. Hypocrisy has always been best served lightly toasted. And the bakers, they were finally freed from their most poisonous tricks, but not from overwork. Factory baking replaced independent shops, and automation did what Victorians did best, expanded misery efficiently. And yet, there's something oddly poetic in this. A trade that fed millions, quietly killing some, exhausting others, and teaching the empire a bitter lesson that progress without protection always comes with a chemical aftertaste. So, next time you see a fresh golden loaf, take a slow breath, smell the crust, savor the safety, and remember the nameless bakers who quite literally worked themselves to death, trying to make bread whiter than the truth behind it. Let's float a little further next time, into the kitchens of Victorian England, where the pastries sparkled, sometimes because they were glazed with mercury. Welcome, bike drifters of history. If you're still awake after Victorian bakers and their arsenic sprinkles, congratulations. You've officially survived your first loaf of Industrial Revolution bread. Tonight, we keep gliding through the same flour-dusted nightmare, deeper into the kitchens, the crimes, and the curious comfort of poison. So, picture this continuation, exactly where we left off. The scent of hot bread thick in the early fog, a shop boy dragging trays while trying not to cough himself into next week. His master, the baker, half asleep, still adding mysterious powders to keep the loaves fresh. And outside, factory chimneys exhaling soot like a symphony of asthma. That's Victorian optimism for you. You'd think that, after the bread scandals and arsenic candies, someone would have said, let's maybe not put poison in lunch. But no, this is the 19th century, the era where logic politely nodded and waited its turn behind profit. Reform came slowly, dragged along by dying victims and annoyed doctors. Now, one of the oddest things about arsenic was that it was always the villain it should have been. People genuinely used it for nearly everything. Arsenic soap for pale Victorian skin. Absolutely. Arsenic dress dyes for fashion. Green wallpaper with arsenic pigments. Consider it the luxury backdrop for genteel suffocation. So when a baker accidentally mixed a little of it into the dough, it wasn't insane. It was just Tuesday. We can't even entirely blame the bakers here. The real confusion started with the way ingredients were sold. You didn't go to a clean, labeled, color-coded supermarket aisle. You went to a dim shop where dozens of powders lived in identical paper sacks. Sugar, plaster, alum, arsenic, same color, same texture. The only difference was hope, or lack thereof. This led to some truly grim comedy of errors. There is a documented case in 1845 where a baker mistakenly seasoned his dough with a white powder that he thought was flour improver. It wasn't tea. It was quicklime. Half the customers ended up with chemical burns to the mouth. One even lost teeth. Apparently. That was what people meant by a sharp flavor. And then there was the fine art of stretching ingredients. Bakers loved to extend the yield of flour by adding all kinds of creative fillers. Bean meal, ground bone, plastered dust, even alum left over from tanneries. If you've ever wondered what class oppression tastes like, it probably tastes like wall-dust bread with a side of shattered dreams. The Victorians were in a bizarre relationship with bread. They adored it the way modern people love Wi-Fi. Can't live without it, but never think about how it's made. It wasn't until newspapers began publicly shaming the adulterators that public paranoia took hold. One man in particular deserves credit. Dr. Arthur Hill, a doctor with the persistence of a mosquito and the patience of a saint. He began systematically testing London's food supplies under the microscope. His reports in the Lancet Asterix, read like a Victorian horror anthology. He found red lead in anchovies, copper in pickles, and chalk in milk. Bread, naturally, got an entire chapter. His findings: most loaves weren't just wheat. They were small geological samplers. Heisel became a reluctant celebrity. People would send him samples of bread wrapped in napkins, begging him to identify what fresh misery lay within their breakfast. His lab must have looked like a bakery run by plague doctors. Eventually, his persistence pushed Parliament into hesitant action. But political reform in that era was less swift justice, and more 8 years of tea, debates, and probably fainting from boredom. Still, it worked. A small start. Food inspections began. But only big cities cared. Out in the countryside, bakers still followed their ancestral recipes for mild intestinal trauma. Meanwhile, industrialization kept cranking its wheels. Bread production became mechanized. What once required the intuition of a human hand was now handled by machines that didn't care whether the flour was bleached or toxic. The human touch was gone. Unless, of course, you counted the sweat dripping into the dough. What's subtly horrifying is that all this happened alongside the great Victorian obsession with moral purity. This was the nation preaching temperance, chastity, and divine order, while quietly eating arsenic muffins. It's like running a church service inside a gunpowder factory. Then there's the irony of whiteness. White bread was pure, noble, civilized, or so they claimed. It symbolized control, refinement, and empire. But whiteness came at a literal cost. Chalk, alum, and chemical bleach. In making bread more white, they basically bleached the life out of it. You could say Victorian society was colorless both in bread and in imagination. Of course, that obsession trickled down into class rivalry. The poor had coarse brown bread, practical and nourishing. The rich had dazzling white loaves, so refined it might dissolve in a gentle breeze. Yet, The rich were eating the more toxic version. Poetic justice served warm. One cannot forget the bakers themselves, trapped in furnace-like shops with shifting nighttime rhythms. Imagine spending decades inhaling flour particles so fine they coated your throat like fog. Contemporary observers described bakers who looked perpetually and when they coughed, flour came out, literally, romantic. If you're into Edwardian respiratory failure, sleep deprivation wasn't a figure of speech. Bakers rarely saw daylight. Nights spent kneading, mornings spent delivering, afternoons spent staggering into brief, delirious naps. Their children often joined in, because what is childhood without a little mandatory labor next to ovens, hot enough to bake both bread and bones? And then there were the rats. Bakeries, warm and full of crumbs, were basically rodent resorts. Bakers occasionally claimed they could hear rats squeaking inside the cooling loaves. Whether that's true or just folklore is unclear, but given how loose sanitary rules were, it's not impossible. Victorian hygiene laws made modern street food look like Michelin dining. When the first public food reform meetings were held, many bakers objected. They didn't appreciate being accused of killing their customers when, in their minds, they were barely making ends meet. "Everyone does it," they said, a phrase that has excused nearly every disaster since civilization began. Still, there were those who changed. A small but sincere number of bakers began advertising pure bread, made without a dot. Some even displayed certificates. Others weren't above forging those too, because, again, capitalism, purity was profitable now, and fraud was eternal. As the 1870s arrived, industrial milling techniques improved, producing naturally whiter flour. The need for chemical deception finally declined. Ironically, just as bread became safer, the working poor could no longer afford as much of it. The nightmare faded quietly, not because of morality, but because technology caught up. By then, the era of deadly dough was turning into nostalgia. People look back fondly on the simplicity of real bread, which is, of course, hilarious, considering that real bread once came with arsenic sprinkles and occasional chalk flavoring. Humans have short memories and long romantic streaks. It is strange to think that some of the Victorian bakers who pioneered safer methods would have outlived their trade. Reputation, but not their lungs. Chronic illnesses, bronchitis, emphysema, the silent pension plan of the working man. Many slipped quietly into anonymous graves. Uncelebrated but essential. For every royal feast or elegant banquet, there'd been a baker behind it, shuffling through flour at midnight, breathing death, one loaf at a time. So, when you next pass by a modern bakery window and see a perfect sourdough, take a second. Think of the ghosts in the flour, the Victorians who made baking both an art and an accidental poisoning spree. Let's float onward next time, toward the people behind those grand Victorian feasts. The cooks who worked in silence, standing inches away from arsenic-colored wallpaper, serving opulent dinners under chandeliers burning whale oil. Because in every banquet hall of the empire, there was a quiet drizzle of poison, elegant, inevitable, and just a little sweet. Welcome, bike night wanderers. If you've made it through 2 helpings of Victorian bread, congratulations, your stomach is sturdier than most 19th century workers. Tonight, we drift into the kitchens behind closed doors, where the real culinary tragedies quietly unfolded. The era wasn't just about toxic bread. It was also about deadly dinners prepared by cooks who didn't realize they were slow cooking themselves. Let's start with a grand Victorian kitchen. Picture it. A sprawling, smoky room tucked below a mansion, ceiling dripping with condensation, and a fireplace that roared day and night. Copper pots gleamed like trophies polished daily with pride. And there's the problem. Those shiny copper beauties weren't just decor. They were chemical time bombs. Copper looks lovely. It also reacts beautifully with basically everything acidic. Think vinegar, lemon juice, or tomato. The Victorians adored pickles and sauces, full of both. The result? Copper acetate. Poison with a metallic aftertaste. And it wasn't rare. Servants fell ill, often stomach cramps, vomiting, that delightful shade of green nobody wants to see before dessert. But since the word food poisoning hadn't made it into the medical vocabulary yet, most cases were chalked up to gastric trouble, which, to be fair, could describe almost any Victorian illness. Of course, copper was only part of the cheerful kitchen ensemble. You also had lead pipes bringing in water, lead glazes on ceramics, lead weights on scales. Basically, everything short of the cooker itself contained lead, and it leached into everything: water, soup, even milk. Lead poisoning became so common that people didn't notice it had symptoms: fatigue, stomach pain, irritability, and mental fog, which neatly sums up the Victorian personality. Actually, but back to the cooks. Their kitchens were laboratories without safety goggles. Imagine a girl of 19, hair tied in a handkerchief, stirring a stew in a copper pot over a coal stove. The air thick with soot, her lungs tight from smoke. Upstairs, a banquet prepares to honor a visiting dignitary. Downstairs, she's scraping green residue from the pan, unaware that's oxidized copper. Slowly, invisibly, she's inhaling her way to early retirement. Let's float over to one of the strangest hallmarks of Victorian dining: bright, unnatural food colors. Everyone wanted rich hues: crimson jellies, emerald sweets, golden sauces, and yes, the colors came straight from the chemist's shelf. Mercury sulfide for deep red, lead chromate for sunny yellow, arsenic green. Naturally, because nothing saith appetite like ingesting the raw materials of a paint factory. Take green peas. For instance, Victorians couldn't leave well enough alone. Fresh peas faded quickly after picking, turning dull, which was unacceptable, so merchants perked them up by soaking them in a copper solution. Boil a dazzling shade of poison green. Housewives loved it. Doctors less so. There is a record from the mid-1800s of several families falling violently ill the same week after eating particularly lively-looking peas. And because they were Victorians, they did it again next week. Houst to be souré. Meanwhile, in great houses, cooks experimented endlessly with dishes for the social elite. Presentation mattered, subtle color, and symmetry. The more elaborate your table display, the higher your standing. And what's a little lead-laced frosting compared to social prestige? But the real hidden killer wasn't copper or arsenicate, was the environment itself. Victorian kitchens were basically furnaces built underground. Ventilation was minimal. Coal smoke clung to stone walls. Every inhale meant a shot of carbon, sulfur, and probably a rat or two vacationing behind the pantry. Cooks developed the kind of chronic cough that made them sound like collapsing furniture. They accepted it. Kitchen cough. Te caged Italiano. Just another part of service life. And speaking of rats, oh, the rats. Every major kitchen fought them, and every method of poison backfired in at least one tragicomic way. Arsenic-list bait was common. So common that sometimes the bread intended for the traps accidentally joined the household table. You'd think people would label it, but labels were an extravagance. Besides, arsenic looked exactly like flour. The universe has a sense of irony. There is one rather morbid tale from 1867 of a cook in Leeds who accidentally served arsenic-laced dumplings to an entire family. 6 died within hours. The investigation revealed she'd mistaken rat powder for baking soda. The jars looked the same, and because this was tea-time Britain, everyone had already finished eating before they realized the dumplings tasted a bit earthy. Victorian politeness until the very end. Even palace kitchens weren't immune. Queen Victoria's staff faced a food poisoning scare in the 1870s after one banquet left several attendants violently ill. Analysis hinted at copper contamination from improperly tinned pans. The palace quietly replaced the cookware and issued no public statement. The monarchy, apparently, preferred scandal-free and let's glide now into something that sounds trivial but wasn't wallpaper. The kitchen walls were often covered with decorative wallpaper made with arsenic green pigments. Moisture and heat caused microscopic arsenic dust to flake off into the air, which means every time the cooks opened the oven, they breathed in a warm puff of slow murder. Victorian architecture. Beautiful, breathable, fatal. If we zoom out, the entire ecosystem of the Victorian household was basically a chemical trap disguised as civilization. Food in, poison out. The upper classes ate elegantly at tables set with lead crystal glasses and pewter dishes, both leaching toxins. Servants cleaned those items with bare hands, inhaling fumes. By the age of 30, most were riddled with ailments doctors called general weakness, which translates to your organs are If this all sounds grim, remember the tone of the times. Public health was still new science. Most people sincerely believed that bad smells, not chemicals, caused illness, so they fought miasma, the evil air, by scrubbing surfaces with carbolic acid and bleaching the walls, which, naturally, caused new rounds of poisoning. Progress was, as always, a loop with extra suffering attached. And yet, amid all this, cooking evolved. Recipes grew more complex, food presentation more refined. The Victorians gave us puddings, sauces, layered desserts, and the art of tea service. They built a sophisticated culinary culture on top of toxic foundations. Elegant decadence, powered by invisible danger. The empire's favorite motif. By evening, after 12 hours of sweating and smoke, a cook might finally sit down, wipe airbrow, and sip tea made with water from a lead pipe, milk from a cow eating turnip tops grown in arsenic soil, and sugar bleached with bone ash. She'd think, what a fine day's work. And somehow, she wasn't entirely wrong. Survival in the Victorian kitchen was itself an accomplishment. So next time someone romanticizes old-fashioned cooking, imagine that dim cellar kitchen, glowing copper pots, fumes rising like ghosts, and a tired cook stirring a pot of something that smells delicious and deadly. That's Heriton Cuisine, Victorian edition. We'll drift next time into the dining rooms above, where high society dined with blissfully unaware that their fine bone china plates and green wallpaper were plotting their demise. Welcome, bike wanderers of sleepless history. Tonight, we drift upstairs, out of the sooty kitchen, and into the glittering dining rooms of Victorian high society. Up here, everything shines. The tableware gleams, the candelabras flicker, and the wine sparkles like liquid gemstones. But, as always, Victorian beauty came with a side of slow, stylish death. Let's set the scene. Picture a grand townhouse in Belgravia around 1875. Gas lamps hissing faintly. Soft piano music in the drawing room. Guests arriving in satin and lace, gloved and perfumed. The dinner table itself, a masterpiece. Silver cutlery, gilt-egged china, crystal goblets, and, unfortunately, enough toxic elements to qualify as a chemistry set. The Victorians adored grandeur. A dinner wasn't just dinner. It was performance art. Everything had to reflect wealth, taste, and empire. But the irony, nearly every object within arm's reach could kill you slowly and politely, which, come to think of it, feels rather on brand for the age of propriety. Let's start with the wallpaper. Because yes, they dined surrounded by poison. The famous Shields, green and emerald green wallpapers contained arsenic compounds. When the candle flames and gas lights heated the air, tiny arsenic particles drifted off into the room, like invisible snow. People thought the shimmer looked beautiful under lamplight. They didn't realize they were breathing theatrical death. Tere is a particularly grim letter from a visiting Frenchman in 1857, describing a London dinner party where half the guests began coughing and experiencing headaches He called it the English ambience. Little did he know, the ambience was literally trying to kill him. And speaking of glamour, those glittering crystal decanters catching the light on the table, they were made with lead oxide. Lead crystal, the higher the lead content, the brighter the sparkle. Wine and brandy left overnight in them absorbed the metal beautifully. Over time, frequent drinkers developed what doctors charitably called gouty tendencies. Translation: lead poisoning. The aristocracy had a knack for getting fancy versions of poor people's problems. Now, let's talk about the table settings themselves. Pewter plates were still common in mid-century households, made of tin with a generous dash of lead. Soups, sauces, anything acidic would leach the metal. Eating from them was like slowly nibbling on batteries. Ceramic dishes weren't safe. Many were glazed with lead-based compounds that gave that glossy, high-end shine Victorians loved. One could almost say Victorian dining was radiant in more ways than one. But if the table could harm you, the food could easily finish the job. The upper classes devoured delicacies imported from across the empire: anchovies, spices, coffees, preserved meats, and every single one was suspect. Tin cans, newly popular, were sealed with lead solder. Canned meats were convenient wonders, until someone noticed that sailors were losing teeth and sanity after months of eating them. The official excuse: climate exhaustion. Sure. Then there was milk, delivered fresh from countryside dairies, stored in open pails during the long train ride to London. By the time it reached townhouses, it had fermented gently. Servants sweetened it with a pinch of chalk or formalin to disguise the smell. A little deception to ensure the master's breakfast looked spotless. They called it ingenuity. The body called it malpractice. And of course, no Victorian feast was complete without that dazzling parade of cakes, custards, and puddings. Unfortunately, the color revolution was in full swing. Bright red sweets contained mercury sulfide. Yellows came from lead chromate, greens from copper arsenite. Imagine nibbling a PD4 that doubles as an art supply hazard list. Guests would compliment the chef on those astonishingly vivid colors. They weren't wrong. It's almost poetic. A society obsessed with appearance, polishing itself into oblivion. To dine in such rooms was to participate in a performance of elegance that doubled as a chemistry experiment. One wrong glaze, one cheap supplier, one counterfeit spice, and your fashionable dinner could become a slow funeral in installments. And while the elite hosted dinners bathed in candlelight, lower classes dined under flickering gas lamps whose mantles released toxins of their own. The air of Victorian interiors was already a soup of combustion gases, coal dust, and unfiltered air. Yet, this was considered progress. They'd escaped the cold darkness of earlier centuries. Now they could choke to death brightly. Let us linger on one strangely tragicomic episode: the story of arsenic-laced wallpaper and dinner guests in high society. In 1859, Lady Harriet Bootle Wilbraham, yes, a real name, redecorated her dining room with a new green wallpaper. It was fashionable, it was splendid, and within weeks, her dinner guests began falling ill after long evenings in the room. Doctors puzzled. Servants whispered. The culprit: the wallpaper pigment. Tests later showed the air carried arsenic traces 1,000 times above tolerable levels. Lady Harriet reportedly denied everything and kept the wallpaper because it matched the curtains beautifully. Priorities. One cannot overstate how thoroughly the Victorians trusted industry. If it was sold in a store, it must be safe. The idea that manufacturers might lie or simply not care made people uncomfortable. So they didn't think about it. Industrial accidents were the price of progress, and the rich, in their own perfumed way, paid as much of that price as anyone. But death moved slowly in polite society. Chronic lead exposure took years to reveal itself. Arsenic carpet dust worked quietly. Dinner guests didn't collapse dramatically into their pudding. They just grew sicker, paler, thinner. Doctors diagnosed everything as nervous exhaustion, because heaven forbid a duchess be poisoned by her decor. One could argue that the entire Victorian dining ritual was built on denial. Guests knew the oysters might be bad, the gravy odd, the air thick, but appearances came first. To refuse food was rudeness. People would rather die gracefully than dine awkwardly, and sometimes they did both at once. Even their wine cellars weren't safe. Some vintners used lead acetate, also called sugar of lead, to sweeten inferior wines. The result tasted exquisite until it didn't. The wealthy gently sipped their fortune's worth, unaware their liver was staging a quiet rebellion. Lead poisoning even had quaint nicknames in upper circles: painteress colic or wine affliction. Nothing like branding your ailments to make them respectable. There's an oddly polite fatalism in all of this. Victorian high society lived surrounded by toxins and managed to treat it as aesthetics. Green curtains, golden glazes, crystal sparkle. All beautiful, all deadly. They loved artifice so much They couldn't see where the art ended and the poison began. By the 1890s, whispers of change were audible. Chemists were warning the public about pigments and pottery. New standards emerged for glass and food dyes. But for decades before that, the empire's dinner tables had doubled as laboratories in decorative danger. So, if you picture a Victorian banquet, now glittering silver platters, murmured conversation, the scent of roast and candle wax, imagine the invisible shimmer above it all. Arsenic motes, lead vapors, copper dust, the slow ballet of genteel poisoning, waltzing above the finest tablecloths. As you drift to sleep, consider this small comfort. Your modern dinner, for all its processed scenes, probably won't coat your lungs in chemical varnish or gift you a touch of mercury madness. The Victorians couldn't say the same. They built beauty, opulence, and death into every bite and smiled through it. Let's float next time to the people who studied all this. The early health reformers and scientists who began peeking under the polished crust of Victorian life and asking a quietly revolutionary question. What exactly are we eating? Welcome back, my sleepless scholars. We've drifted through bakeries dusted in poison, kitchens fogged with copper fumes, and dining rooms shimmering with lead crystal. It is time to meet the people who finally dared to ask the question no one wanted asked. Why does everything we eat, drink, or breathe slowly kill us? Entered the Victorian chemists, the unsung detectives of doom. People who spent long nights staring through microscopes at breadcrumbs and swabs of butter, only to realize they were basically studying murder in powdered form. Let's begin with a name you've heard before. The stubborn doctor turned food sleuth, Arthur Hill. Imagine a man with the soul of a scientist and the temperament of a mosquito. He just would not stop buzzing around the food industry as head. In the 1850s, working with the Lancet medical journal, he decided to start poking around everyday food, and what he found was so spectacularly horrifying that even the most jaded Victorians had to feign politely. Hazel discovered alum in flour, chalk in sugar, red lead in cayenne pepper, copper in pickles, and a charming mix of sand and grit in mustard. He reported all of it with the precision of a furious librarian cataloging human suffering. The public was scandalized. Merchants were furious. Parliament sighed heavily, briefly put down its tea, and decided something probably ought to be done. Just not immediately. Now, here's the thing about Victorian science. It was brilliant, but lonely. There were no fancy grants or departments. Testing often involved a single man, a candle, and whatever questionable sample a housewife had mailed to him, wrapped in brown paper. Hazel's lab reportedly reeked of vinegar, spoiled milk, and despair. He was essentially running the world's least appetizing bakery experiment. In 1855, the Lancet Sanitary Commission was formed, an early attempt to investigate the national diet. Think of it as the original restaurant review, except instead of stars, they handed out horror. They analyzed markets, tea shops, bakeries, dairies, and discovered that most food sold in Britain was part edible, part industrial experiment. Public trust cracked. For the first time, Victorians looked at their bread and wondered how many chemicals they'd had for breakfast. But not everyone loved the Crusaders. Food sellers accused Hazel and his allies of fearmont. People have eaten this way for years, they said, as though mass intestinal suffering was part of the charm. Bakers called him unpatriotic. Grocers claimed he ruined business. Hazel and Ballard kept publishing. The man practically weaponized tedium. Long, detailed scientific papers that left no room for denial. He turned chemistry into slow, bureaucratic vengeance. Then came Friedrich Occam, an earlier, equally fascinating figure, born in Germany but working in London before Hazel made headlines. Occam had already written a treatise on adulterations of food in 1820. It was bold, accusatory, and full of sentences like, "There is death in the pot." The Victorians did not appreciate such candor. His work led to lawsuits. His lab was vandalized, and he eventually fled to Germany amid scandal. You could say he was cancelled, 19th century edition. But Occam had planted the seed. Hazel watered it with outrage, and slowly, Piece by piece, the modern science of public health emerged from the fog of outdated politeness. The government eventually passed the 1860 Adulteration of Food and Drink Act, followed by the more rigorous 1875 Sale of Food and Drugs Act. Think of those as the ancestor of every modern food label you've ever ignored. Of course, progress was still painfully British, polite, gradual, and bureaucratic enough to bore people back into apathy. Inspectors were appointed, then underfunded. Laboratories were opened, then ignored. It took decades to cleanse the empire's appetite of ambition/arson. Meanwhile, chemists kept poking the bear. They analyzed cosmetics, wallpapers, medicines, and found the same story everywhere. Arsenic in face powder, mercury in skin creams. Lead in hair dye, even children as toys were turning into miniature toxic souvenirs. It was as if the entire Industrial Revolution had been designed by a slightly insane alchemist obsessed with shiny colors. Some scientists began experimenting with better alternatives. They pioneered tin linings for pens, enamel glazes, and safer pigments. You know, things were going poorly when the phrase, "safe enough not to cause immediate paralysis," was considered progress. Let's float momentarily to a lab in the 1870s. You might see a weary chemist stirring strange brews over a burner, his own fingers stained from the very substances he's condemning. Health reformers loved calling them heroes, but these men were poisoning themselves, too. They inhaled arsenic dust, handled mercury daily, and occasionally lost hair or teeth for their trouble. Occupational hazard, or, as they called it, Thursday. And then came the journalists. Nothing moves society quite like scandal with a moral edge. Papers began running investigations with titles like, "Is Your Baker Honest?" and "What Lies in Your Loaf?" Middle-class readers gasped dramatically between bites of their possibly lethal breakfast toast. Reform movements sprouted pure food leagues, public lectures, even early awareness posters. Victorian philanthropy met chemistry, and together they made caution fashionable. It's worth noting that sanitation reform and food reform grew side by side. As one world discovered sewage, the other discovered soup ingredients. England, by the late century, was basically realizing en masse that filth didn't belong anywhere near the human digestive tract. A profound revelation only a few thousand years late. And amidst all this seriousness, there was unintentional comedy. Early inspectors often carried portable test kits for arsenic reagents stored in fragile bottles. More than one overzealous health officer accidentally blew up his own samples. Public health was dangerous work when your toolkit included nitric acid in a pocket flask. Still, the momentum built. Universities began founding departments of analytical chemistry. The idea that public safety could be measured that truth could be proved through science, not gossip, was revolutionary. Victorians may have built pollution, but they also invented regulation. By the 1880s, food started to stabilize. Not perfectly, but noticeably. Bread was less fluorescent, sweets more edible, and milk less mysterious. The British stomach finally got a reprieve, but for all the reforms, the chemists often remained nameless, quiet figures working in basements, crunching numbers over half-poisoned tea. They had replaced artisanal ignorance with scientific anxiety. The world had changed. Safer, duller, healthier, maybe a bit more sterile. Some would say the thrill was gone, but mostly, the death was gone, too, which seems like a fair trade. So, as you drift tonight, think of those sleepless chemists, bent over their microscopes, saving lives one sample at a time. Gray-faced heroes who made dinner survivable. Their reward: chronic headaches and the satisfaction of being slightly less dead than their patients. Next time we'll glide toward the strange legacy left behind, when the Victorians' obsession with purity turned into something even stranger. The birth of the modern food industry, where the poison wasn't in the bread anymore, but maybe in the philosophy. Welcome back, my nocturnal listeners. We've wandered through poisoned bakeries, copper kitchens, and arsenic-dusted dining rooms. Tonight, we settle into the twilight of the 19th century, a time when Britain finally decided that maybe purity was fashionable after all. The result was both noble and as usual, unintentionally, ridiculous. By the 1880s, food reform had gone mainstream. People wanted purity, safety, and ideally, something that didn't taste like wallpaper pigment. But after decades of chemical creativity, true simplicity was almost impossible. The Victorians had built an empire on innovation, and innovation rarely retreats quietly. So, as old poisons faded, new processed miracles took their place. Let's begin with the grocery revolution. Gone were the chaotic days of unlabeled sacks and powders. Now, the middle class wanted packages, brands, with names, seals, and trust. Enter the birth of household icons. Cadbury, Heinz, Kellogg's, Nestle, companies that promised moral purity in edible form. They were practically selling virtue with sugar on top. The story of the Cadbury family is the perfect example. They were Quakers, strict moralists, who believed indulgence could be wholesome if marketed as innocent comfort. Their factory in Bonneville was practically a social experiment. Gardens, libraries, no pubs. Workers lived in newly built housing. Everyone bathed in cocoa dust instead of coal smoke. It was par food empire, par utopian cult of chocolate. But behind the kindness, there was strategy. The Cadburys, the Rowntrees, the Fry family, all Quakers, realized that the safest moral business was food. Non-alcoholic, non-toxic, and, crucially, addictive in the right way. They sold comfort instead of chaos, and in doing so, they helped invent the idea of honest branding. The Victorian mind loved purity, whether in prayer or packaging. Meanwhile, science was learning to manipulate nature more subtly. Preservatives, emulsifiers, artificial aromas. Chemistry didn't die with the poison panic. It simply rebranded. Instead of arsenic, you got benzoate of soda. Instead of copper coloring, you had harmless-looking coal. Tar dyes, safe-ish, controlled, modern, industrial manipulation hadn't gone away. It had just polished its manners. Factories began producing food that no longer depended on freshness. Pulverate milk, evaporated soups, condensed everything. Shelf life became the new gospel. Housewives rejoiced. No more sour milk or spoiled butter. They didn't know they were becoming the first generation of mass consumers hooked on uniform taste and eternal storage. The scientists who had once condemned adulteration found themselves giving it a facelift. Laws now allowed approved additives. In short, you could tinker with your food, as long as everyone agreed that tinkering was polite. The line between poison and process had blurred nicely. Advertising joined the feast. Early print ads for biscuits and cocoa read like sermons. Guaranteed pure, perfectly wholesome, recommended by physicians. Ironically, the more industrial the product became, the more it was advertised as natural. This, of course, is the same logic that still convinces people in supermarkets today. And it wasn't just about food safety anymore. The Victorian middle class had discovered dietary morality. Eating well meant eating properly, a matter of respectability. Breakfast tables were organized with a moral compass. Oats for restraint, meat for strength, tea for civility. To eat carelessly was almost sinful. The pure food movement morphed into a quiet social code. This obsession extended to health fads. The late century produced a flurry of new diet prophets. Sylvester Graham and his famously joyless. Graham bred John Harvey Kellogg with his anti-pleasure cornflakes, and a parade of vegetarian reformers warning that meat led directly to moral decay. Victorian cuisine became a battlefield between discipline and delight. Irony. As the rich purified their plates spiritually, the working poor still scraped for affordable calories. They couldn't afford Kellogg's lectures on virtue. Processed food filled the gap. Cheap, filling, uniform. Factories churned out canned meats, biscuits, margarine. For the first time, the poor ate the same brands as the rich. If not out of choice, then necessity. It was equality through tinned stew. By the 1890s, Britain was basking in industrial achievement. Food looked safe, clean, and national pride demanded that everything, even hunger, be standardized. But lurking under the white tablecloths was a new sickness. Overprocessing. Vitamins adniti yet been discovered, so no one noticed that stripping every grain and sterilizing every bottle had nutritional costs. The Victorians fought arsenic, won, and walked straight into anemia. Still, they were proud. They'd conquered adulteration with purity, then conquered purity with branding. Bread no longer contained chalk. It was just soft, fluffy, and nutritionally bored. Bakeries boasted hygienic ovens. Milk came in sealed glass bottles, a modern miracle hiding bacterial roulette, until pasteurization became routine. Progress, as ever, was slow and dressed in self-control. Perhaps the most curious outcome of all this reform was psychological. Victorians stopped trusting food made by people. They trusted food made by machines. Mechanization had become synonymous with reliability. The same industrial logic that once killed them now reassured them. They had, in short, mechanized their appetite. By the early 20th century, the idea of homegrown simplicity was nostalgia. Urban families ate factory bread, canned beans, and branded cereal. The taste of nature was something you bought in a box, and behind it all stood the philosophy invented by Victorian reformers: purity, control, and improvement through science. The very laws once meant to protect the public had created the system we still live with: mass production, overseen by laboratory precision. Hazel and Akum would have been horrified and proud all at once. They wanted safety. They gave us shelf life. They wanted honesty. They gave us advertisement. They wanted purity. They got preservatives. That's what you call progress, with a faint taste of irony. So, when we look back at Victorian Britain, we see more than soot and gaslight. We see the prototype of every convenience aisle, every nutrition label, every low-fat promise whispered through centuries. A civilization that tried to escape poison by inventing the modern grocery store. Let's drift away now, slowly, toward the quiet heart of this tale. Not the laboratories or factories, but the ordinary people. The bakers, the cooks, the shopgirls, the milkmen. They lived between reform and risk, working long hours to feed a nation that worshipped cleanliness and rarely achieved it. Because in the end, that's the real Victorian story: a society desperate to be pure, forever chasing it, and poisoning itself just a little less each decade, until purity became profit. Next time, we'll close our long, sleepy loop with the final part, when all the flowers settled in the ghosts of bread, arsenic, and ambition faded into the gray modern world of better living through chemistry. Welcome, bike drifters of dusty history. Tonight, we reach the quiet end of our journey, the end of the loaf, the final chew of the century. We began in flour-dusted bakeries full of poison and ambition. We floated through kitchens alive with copper fumes, dining rooms full of shimmering decor and invisible death. And now, in the soft electric light of the 20th century's dawn, we find something at once safer and stranger, a world that finally learned to control its poisons by embracing them. By 1900, Britain was a nation obsessed with progress. The soot-stained empire that had once flavored its bread with powdered chalk was now bottling pharmaceuticals, blending tonics, and inventing the supermarket. Science had triumphed, or at least made a convincing sales pitch. The Victorian fear of filth had birthed an enormous appetite for control, and chemistry was the new religion. The phrase "better living through chemistry" hadn't been coined yet, but the faith was already there. People trusted science in their kitchens, their bathrooms, their arteries. Soap companies sold hygiene as patriotism. Toothpaste and tinned milk carried moral overtones. Safety had become marketing. The same empire that once sprinkled alum into bread now sprinkled progress across its advertisements. Let's take a slow stroll through one of those early 20th century stores. Glass jars gleam behind counters. The air smells like sweetened starch. Every box boasts purity, modernity, and health. Labels now matter, printed in uniform fonts, referencing laws established just decades earlier by the same crusaders who once scraped arsenic off pastries. The revolution had succeeded. Only no one asked what came next. Factories kept perfecting the art of predictability. Butter was replaced by margarine. Handmade bread gave way to fluffy loaves shaped by machines. There was comfort in sameness. The housewife of 1905 could serve breakfast that looked identical day after day. Uniform eggs, identical toast, clean packaging. Modernity had eliminated surprise, and, incidentally, much of the flavor. Chemistry didn't stop at the kitchen. It followed people into every corner of life. Clothing dyes that once contained liver-gnawing arsenic were replaced by the first synthetic anilines. Still dangerous, but now legally so. Cleaning products grew more powerful. Perfumes mixed in laboratories. Painkillers like aspirin became the new miracle, a small white promise in a bottle. The same scientific spirit that once poisoned the population now claimed to protect it. Humanity had evolved from accidental toxicity to managed risk. It would be poetic to say the Victorians learned moderation, but they didn't. They simply industrialized precision. The same generation that cracked down on adulterated flour soon embraced chemical fertilizers that would later leach into rivers. They built their utopia of cleanliness on the same foundation of faith, the faith that human cleverness could outsmart nature and consequence. But let's drift, for a moment, back into a quieter picture. The small village bakery that survived into the modern age. Gone were the chalk bowls. Der Loomdust the endless pre-dawn shifts. Now there's an electric mixer humming softly, a clock on the wall, a bag of standardized flour marked approved. The baker hums, yawns, folds dough under lamplight. He doesn't know the battles fought to reach this calm. His bread is safe, unremarkable, and 1,000 reforms deep. The ghosts of alum and arsenic hover faintly, grateful and forgotten. Meanwhile, nostalgia was creeping in. As the industrial world sped forward, writers and romantic reformers started missing the messy authenticity of Old England. They wrote wistful essays about the village loaf, the honest meal, the wholesome kitchen. They forgot, conveniently, that those loaves sometimes glowed with copper and those kitchens contained lethal green wallpaper. Nostalgia has always had selective vision. Still, the seed of that nostalgia mattered. It planted future movements, organic food, whole grain bread, artisan, everything. Ironically, every time a modern hipster bakery advertises authentic Victorian sourdough, it resurrects the aesthetic of an era that almost poisoned a nation. But that's the charm of history. We recycle even our disasters. Chemistry continued its quiet colonization. Artificial flavors, preservatives, vitamins, all born from the same scientific discipline that once tested bakers' flour for arsenic. The laboratories of caution had become laboratories of creativity. Health reform turned into consumer science. Pura was no longer about survival. It was about branding your breakfast cereal. If you think about it, the Victorian obsession with purity shaped our entire modern vocabulary. Every shampoo labeled clean, every yogurt claiming natural, every product promising wholesome is a descendant of 19th century paranoia. The Victorians learned to fear contamination so profoundly that whole industries exist today to reassure us. We safe, preferably for a subscription fee. And somewhere behind the hum of modern factories you can still feel the faint rhythm of those first chemists scraping residue from bread. Samples the bakers working sleepless under floured light, the cooks polishing green copper pots, unaware they were building history in every cough. Their story is buried in the crust of progress, invisible, but everywhere. One could almost admire the symmetry. The same century that filled stomachs with slow poison ended by industrializing health. The Victorians wanted control. And they got it. Standardized nutrition, regulated markets, packaged humanity. The danger never truly disappeared. It just became efficient. So as we close this long, twilight ramble through Sutton science, take a small moment to appreciate your next slice of modern bread. It may not taste extraordinary. It might even be bland, but it comes without arsenic, chalk, or alum. That's quiet triumph. The kind that leaves no monument, only the absence of pain. History often ends, not with explosions, but with sighs of relief. The Victorian era slipped into the modern age that way exhausted, coughing, but alive. They invented our comforts while stumbling through their nightmares. They made every breakfast safer, stranger, and ultimately ours. So breathe, stretch, and let that thought settle. Somewhere, a long line of bakers, reformers, cooks, and chemists nod in sleepy approval. The ovens are cooler now, the air clearer, the bread less ambitious, and maybe, just maybe, that's progress enough. Rome wasn't built in a day, but it sure did fall apart in one, depending on how you view Julius Caesar's calendar. He was born in 100 BCE, in the heart of Rome, into a patrician family that liked to remind everyone they were descendants of gods. Specifically, Venus. Because of course they were. The Julian clan had that classic Roman habit of mixing religion with politics, boosting their prestige by claiming divine blood, but somehow never enough divine wisdom to stay out of bankruptcy. Young Caesar grew up, surrounded by a city that was half marble, half chaos. Rome was powerful, yes, but also deeply corrupt. Senators traded favors, street mobs liked throwing stones for sport, and elections were won with enough bribery to bankrupt a small empire. In other words, the perfect environment for an ambitious boy with charm and nerve. Caesar's childhood was comfortable, but precarious. His father died suddenly when he was 16, leaving him responsible for his family's fading fortune. His mother, Aurelia, ran the household with the terrifying efficiency for which Roman matrons were famous. It was Aurelia who toughened him, and later, everyone would agree that Caesar inherited her brain and none of his father's restraint. Rome was boiling politically, even then. Sulla, the dictator, had seized control after a bloody civil war. He had a charming habit of posting prescription lists, name sheets of his enemies, which basically meant public permission to murder them and take their property. Caesar just happened to be related by marriage to one of those enemies. Not a great position for a teenager who wanted to keep breathing. When Sulla demanded Caesar divorce his wife Cornelia to prove loyalty, Caesar refused. That decision nearly got him killed. He had to flee Rome, living in obscure towns, dodging soldiers, and constantly moving. Nothing like starting your 20s as a political fugitive. Reportedly, someone pleaded with Sulla not to kill the boy, and Sulla, with grim foresight, said, "In this Caesar, there are many Mariuses." Translation: this one's trouble. Eventually, Sulla's regime softened, and Caesar returned. But life hadn't gotten easier. He was broke, disease-ridden, and sporting a reputation as that annoyingly brave patrician kid who wouldn't give up. He joined the army to pay debts and to escape creditors, a classic Roman job solution. There, he distinguished himself fast, showing the bravery of someone who either had a death wish or absolute confidence in destiny. Maybe bought. One dramatic story tells of Caesar in Asia Minor, seizing a city almost single-handedly when pirates kidnapped him. Yes, pirates. In a scene that sounds half comedy, half legend, Caesar was captured by Cilician pirates who demanded a ransom of 20 talents. He laughed and told them they clearly didn't know who they were dealing with and should ask for 50. Then, while captive, he treated them more like subordinates than kidnappers, shushing their games, writing poetry, and promising, quite seriously, that he would return later and crucify them. Once ransomed, he raised a fleet, hunted them down, and kept his word. Efficient, dramatic, and disturbingly calm, the Julius Caesar brand in its early form. When he returned to Rome, he began the slow, slippery climb through the political ranks. The Roman Curs Caesanorum was basically a prestige ladder. Military service, minor magistracies priestly appointments, and finally, bigger political offices. Caesar moved upward with alarming smoothness, mostly because he had mastered the arts of flattering, borrowing, and performing. He was a born populist. Every public speech was part theater, part campaign rally. By the time he served as Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, Caesar had debts so vast they could sink a province. He owed millions of sesterces, but treated it like a minor obstacle. He once joked that money was only useful if spent on power. Rome's creditors were less entertained. His early marriage alliances were political chess. After Cornelia's death, he married Pompey, a granddaughter of Sulla, because politics forgave everything except financial stagnation. It seemed useful until an awkward incident, the Bonadi scandal. During a women-only religious festival held at Caesar's house, a young patrician disguised as a woman snuck in, apparently too court-pumped, The scandal was enormous. Caesar divorced Pompey with his now famous remark, "Caesar's wife must be above suspicion," which basically meant he didn't care if she was innocent. Optics mattered more than affection. Ten come Caesares, allianced with two other men who shared his love for ambition and dislike for limits, Pompey and Pompey was Rome's golden general, Crassus, the richest man in the city, and Caesar, the one clever enough to make both think they needed him. Together they formed what historians now call the First Triumvirate, though at the time it probably felt more like a group project doomed from pride. Caesar secured his dream post, governor of Gaul. That meant power, money, and most importantly, an army. Out there, far from Rome's gossip and creditors, he reinvented himself as a conqueror. What followed were campaigns both brilliant and brutal. He fought Gallic tribes for nearly a decade, writing dispatches that were part propaganda, part travel diary. His asterisk commentaries on the Gallic War asterisk painted him as an unstoppable commander civilizing Europe, which was spin, considering most of Gaul was already moderately civilized until he burned it. His victories filled Roman treasuries with gold and slaves. Meanwhile, his growing fame terrified the Senate. They didn't like charismatic generals with armies loyal to them personally. Rome had seen that movie before, but Caesar didn't intend to pause. Ecentropes staged triumphs, and casually described genocide as pacification. He was now richer than half the Senate combined. While Caesar rose in Gaul, his allies drifted apart. Crassus, always determined to prove his worth beyond wealth, marched east and managed to die disastrously against the Parthians. Pompey, meanwhile, stayed in Rome, pretending to be respectable. Without Crassus, balance vanished. When Caesar finished his term, the Senate, led by Pompey, demanded he dismiss his army and return home as a private citizen. That, obviously, was not happening. In 49 BCE, Caesar did the one thing everyone feared. He crossed the Rubicon River with his legion. It was a small step, geographically, but a massive one, politically, a declaration of war against the Roman state. The phrase crossing the Rubicon was born here. Legend says he muttered Alia Iacta Ista dies cast as he marched south. Whether he said it or not doesn't matter. It fit the mood perfectly. Pompey and the Senate panicked. Caesar's advance was too fast. Rome emptied overnight as senators fled. Civil war painted the map red again. Caesar styled himself as the protector of the Republic against corrupt elites, which was a charmingly ironic stance for a man marching on the capital with an army. What followed was a masterclass in speed and strategy. He pursued Pompey across Italy, Spain, and Greece. Their showdown came at Pharsalus in 48 BCE. Caesar, outnumbered, outmaneuvered Pompey completely. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping for safety. Egypt, being Egypt, decided to impress Caesar by presenting Pompey's severed head on arrival. Caesar was reportedly horrified, less from compassion, more from the loss of a good rival. Egypt, however, offered a new kind of complication. Cleopatra, the young queen of Egypt, knew charm better than politics, and treated Caesar to both. Their relationship was part alliance, part fascination. Caesar installed her as ruler and lingered long enough for gossip to thrive. Their alleged son, Caesarion, would later become a historical footnote, one that Octavian brutally removed. Back in Rome, Caesar was unstoppable. His enemies dead or scattered, he returned as dictator, first temporarily, then indefinitely. The title was still technically lawful, but in practice, he was monarch in everything but name. The Senate showered him with honors, partly in fear, partly in hope of survival. He accepted all gracefully, the robes, the laurel wreath, the throne-like chair, stopping just short of wearing a crown. For now, here lay the irony. Caesar rebuilt the Republic, even as he hollowed it out. He reformed debt laws, expanded the Senate, started calendars, and even adjusted what people ate. But beneath the reforms, power centered on one name, his own. Republic or not, Rome was under Caesar. And that's the danger of genius. His ambition didn't end with power. He wanted recognition, legacy, eternity. Statues rose, portraits printed on coins, plays recited his victories. People whispered king, and instead of silencing them, he smiled. But for every man in Rome cheering his reforms, there was another narrowing his eyes. Old senators who remembered the Republic sincerely believed they were watching its death. Brutus, Cassius, and dozens of loyalists began to speak of freedom in secret. And Caesar, who had escaped pirates, civil wars, and decades of betrayal, would fail to see the knives closest to him. Let's pause here, before the chamber, before the Ides of March, when Rome's savior took his final stroll into legend. We'll drift into that quiet, rustling conspiracy next, when loyalty, fear, and politics finally bled together under marble ceilings. By the time 44 BCE rolled around, Caesar was Rome. His statues stood everywhere. His portrait sat on coins, once reserved for gods, and his words, half law, half gospel, reached into every province. The Senate called him dictator, perpetu, dictator for life. The phrase sounded harmlessly ceremonial, but it carried the faint echo of monarchy. And monarchy was something Romans still despised, at least officially. Of course, unofficially, they adored the power that came with it. Caesar's reforms were ambitious. He restructured the calendar, giving us the Julian system still in use today, cracked down on corruption, and planned vast construction projects. He even dreamed of reworking the law code and expanding citizenship across the provinces. It was visionary and efficient. It was also terrifying if you were a senator who realized your vote no longer mattered. He appointed men without consulting colleagues, filled offices himself, and, worst of all, acted like he enjoyed it. Caesar's ease of authority made Rome's old noble families anxious. The Republic had once prided itself on shared power and cautious bureaucracy. Caesar ran it like a private company. In meetings, senators would stand silently while he issued bored, twisting his signet ring, already thinking of his next campaign. The topic of kingship simmered in the background. Caesar's ambition had always leaned that way, but he was careful never to name it. Then came a fateful incident, the Lupercalia festival. It was a public celebration full of rituals, fertility dances, and enough wine to drown a province. In front of the crowd, Mark Antony, his devoted general and occasional chaos machine, dramatically offered Caesar a crown. Twice, Caesar declined both times, smiling faintly as the crowd roared, unsure whether to cheer or panic. It looked innocent, even modest, but too many senators watching. It was proof he was testing the waters. By refusing the crown, Caesar made sure they knew it was his choice not to wear it. That day, Rome's elite whispered privately, the Republic was over. It just hadn't admitted it yet. And so, the knives began to sharpen in secret. The plotters came from within his circle, senators, former allies, people he trusted. Cassius Longinus, sharp-minded and bitter. Decimus Brutus, a general and friend. And Marcus Junius Brutus, the moral idealist caught between gratitude and fear. They wrapped their plans in patriotism, claiming to act for freedom. In reality, it was as much self-preservation as principle. Caesar's mercy had made him dangerous. He spared enemies, only for them to realize later that nothing was more terrifying than a man immune to vengeance. As the conspiracy grew, omens appeared everywhere, because this was Rome, where the supernatural was basically breaking news. Sacrificial animals were found without hearts. A soothsayer warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March. His wife Calpurnia dreamed of his statue bleeding. Caesar, ever rational, brushed it off. He was, after all, the man who had marched on Rome and lived. Superstition was for the poor and unlucky. He was neither. March 15th, 44 BCE, began quietly. Caesar was scheduled to attend a Senate meeting at the Theater of Pompey, a location chosen for practical reasons, though the name alone carried a cruel irony. Pompey's Theater, the monument of the rival he had defeated years before. Before leaving, a note was slipped into his hands, warning of the conspiracy. He didn't read it. History's greatest what-if sometimes hinges on one unopened letter. When Caesar entered the hall, the senators rose in their white robes. The scene looked ceremonial, polite conversation, formal greetings. Then, as he took his seat, Tullius Cimber approached, pretending to ask for his brother's pardon. He grabbed Caesar's toga, the signal. The room shifted. Blades appeared from folds of cloth. There were 23 stab wounds in total, though only 1 or 2 fatal. What matters isn't the number, but the choreography. A slow eruption of chaos in a sacred space. Caesar fought back at first. Then, realizing the scale, stopped. According to legend, he covered his face with his toga, tired rather than afraid. The stories say his last words were, "E2, brute," though Roman sources disagree. It might have been silence. Either way, it didn't matter. That line became shorthand for betrayal deeper than pain. When the deed was done, the senators spilled out into the streets in confusion rather than triumph. They had killed the man, but not the system. Rome didn't return to the Republic overnight. It froze, stunned, waiting for someone to explain what came next. Antony, arriving too late to stop the attack, saw the bleeding body laid before Pompey's statue. The symbolism was absurdly perfect. Caesar dead beneath the shadow of his old rival's monument. Rome's power had devoured its own. The conspirators had imagined applause, parades, civic gratitude. Instead, the public wept. Caesar's populism had done its work too well. He had been generous to veterans, forgiving to enemies, and charismatic to the Messiah. They saw not a tyrant's fall, but their champion murdered by jealous nobles. At his funeral, Antony delivered a speech that flipped everything. It wasn't fiery, just measured grief, disappointment, and the slow, deliberate reading of Caesar's will. Turns out, the dictator had left gifts for every citizen. Financial grants, public parks, even land to veterans. It was political genius from beyond the grave. The crowd erupted into fury. Mobs roamed the streets, burning conspirators' homes. Brutus and Cassius fled Rome, realizing their noble act had turned them into fugitives once again. The Republic they claimed to protect unraveled faster than ever. Mark Antony seized authority first. Add muscle charisma and the loyalty of Caesar's veterans. But Caesar had one more unexpected heir, his grandnephew, an 18-year-old named Gaius Octavius. Caesar's will adopted him as son and successor, granting him everything: name, fortune, legacy. The boy took the name Gaius Julius Caesar, Octavian. The world would later call him Augustus. At first, nobody took Octavian seriously. He was young, soft-voiced, and chronically ill. But Rome had always underestimated quiet ambition. Octavian began gathering support quietly. Charming veterans by invoking loyalty to Debene Caesar, he played Antony and the Senate against each other, pretending weakness until he had enough legions to command attention. Wheat in months, he had assembled power that surprised everyone. Caesar's death hadn't ended the empire. It had just redistributed it. Caesar himself began to slip into legend almost instantly. The Senate, in a last, desperate attempt to control the narrative, declared him a god debus hulus. Temples Rose and Comet cited that summer were said to be his soul ascending. The man who had died for reaching too high was now formally divine, sanctified by the same class that had driven its knives into him. Antony and Octavian's uneasy alliance formed briefly under the Sycan triumvirate, joined by Lepat. Together they purged Rome again, restoring those charming prescription lists. Dozens of senators and knights died, including Cicero, the most eloquent survivor of the old republic, whose head was nailed to the rostra as public decor. Freedom, once again, was postponed. But alliances built on shared vengeance rarely last. Antony drifted east, found Cleopatra, and repeated Caesar's experiment in Egyptian romance. Octavian stayed behind, branding himself as the sober defender of Rome's future. When Antony's infatuation turned into exile, the stage set itself for one last civil war. The endgame Caesar had never wanted but made inevitable. At Actium, in 31 BCE, Octavian crushed Antony and Cleopatra's fleet. By then, the Republic was long dead. Octavian returned not as a conqueror, but as its humble restorer. The Senate, exhorted and docile, granted him ultimate power packaged as modest service. He took a new name, Augustus, and ruled for 40 years. Caesar's heir, crowned in subtlety, founded the Roman Empire while pretending to preserve the Republic. In a cosmic joke, The assassins who killed Caesar to save freedom had created monarchy eternal. The irony would have made Caesar smile. So when people speak of his fall, it's misleading. He didn't truly fall. He was absorbed into something larger. His calendar, his reforms, his lineage, his style. The empire would bear his name, his image stamped on coins for centuries. Caesar became not just a name, but a title. Tsar, Kaiser, ruler. The man was mortal. The myth, permanent. Let us drift for a moment on that last image. Caesar's statue in the Forum, laurel crown catching sunlight, the pigeons indifferent above. The streets still echo with his reforms. The Senate still functions. In pretense, the Republic pretends to live, while the empire grows quietly beneath. In the end, Julius Caesar was never just a man. He was Rome's reflection, glorious, flawed, ambitious, and doomed to conquer itself. He was the dream of order born from chaos, slain in the name of freedom, and immortalized by everything that came after. And that's why, to millennia later, we still whisper his story. Not in awe, but in weary recognition. Rome never really ended. It just learned to wear a new crown. History remembers men like Caesar, twice first as humans. Tenas Medas. The human part fades quickly. The myth stays behind, growing larger with every retelling, until even his shadow becomes regal. After his assassination, Caesar's body vanished into legend almost as quickly as it vanished from the Senate floor. His funeral pyre burned in the Forum, bright enough to light Rome's resentment. People tore benches and doors from nearby buildings to feed the flames, screaming his name like a curse and a prayer at once. There's something deeply Roman about turning grief into architecture, and they did exactly that. Within Agyr, a temple rose on that exact spot, dedicated to the divine Julius, a god born not from prophecy, but from very efficient paperwork. The irony is beautiful, in a grim, bureaucratic way. The Senate killed a man for being too royal, then voted him onto the divine roster. That was Roman politics. It managed its guilt through ceremony. The same people who stabbed him now sacrificed to his statue. You almost have to admire the commitment to pageantry. Mark Antony used this divine promotion like fuel. He pointed to the comet that appeared after Caesar's death, shining for 7 nights, and declared it was proof of his ascension. They called it the asterisk, Sidus Aeolium asterisk, the Julium star. Rome ate it up. You could say Caesar started the world's longest-running PR campaign. Literally stellar marketing. But let us drift for a moment from those marble temples to the quieter question: what sort of person was Julius Caesar beneath the titles and poetry? Even his enemies admitted he was charming. He could flatter a crowd and humiliate a rival with the same sentence. He never raised his voice unnecessarily. There's an elegance in that kind of control, the eerie calm of someone who assumes destiny is taking notes. Writers of the time describe him as slim, pale, balding, and oddly magnetic. Not beautiful, but impossible to ignore. His charm wasn't in his looks, but in that polished confidence, the way he made others feel like they were part of his story. Even if only briefly, there's a strange tenderness buried inside his ruthlessness. He forgave enemies often, not because he was kind, but because revenge bored him. Once you've conquered Gaul, petty grudges lose flavor. He loved generosity for its political value. Mercy, after all, looked noble and terrified senators more than bloodshed ever could. He was also, by Roman standards, scandalously fashionable. His rivals mocked him for wearing his toga too loosely, his robe too long, his perfume too noticeable. It seems ridiculous now, but in a society obsessed with austere masculinity, Caesar's elegance was half provocation, half charm. Later, historians called it vanity. Maybe it was, or maybe he simply enjoyed looking like destiny. Then there was his health. Migraines, possible epilepsy, fainting spells. The man who commanded legions sometimes couldn't stand upright during ceremonies, yet he turned frailty into mystique. People whispered he was touched by the gods, every seizure proof that heaven was downloading plans directly into him. You have to respect the branding, but his greatest talent, the one that scared Rome most, was storytelling. Caesar rewrote his own history before anyone else could. His asterisk commentaries on the Gallic War, asterisk warranty, just reports they were masterpieces of narrative control. Written in plain, detached language, they made massacres sound like patriotic housekeeping. Entire villages burned, and Caesar reported it as if noting the weather. The genius was in the understatement. He spoke always in third person. Caesar did this. Caesar decided that, as though the story itself had detached from the man, a literary ghost shaping his legend, line by line, that self-curation became his immortality. Everyone else wrote propaganda. Caesar wrote history, and convinced everyone it was objective. The result? We still read his version. 2,000 years later, his words are our window, polished, selective, quietly triumphant. It's worth asking what he actually wanted. Power, certainly. Glory, obviously. But underneath, maybe order. Rome in his lifetime was a collapsing republic, rotted by bribery and mobs. Caesar probably convinced himself that centralizing power was the moral solution, because no tyrant believes they are one. When he looked in the mirror, he didn't see a despot. He saw a reformer wearing a laurel for Rome's salvation. He was also a sentimentalist in strange ways. His relationship with Cleopatra, political, passionate, perilous, made him human again for a moment. She was charisma incarnate, as he was practicality, refined, and together they made politics look almost romantic. Cleopatra called their son Caesarion, the son born of the sun. Rome, predictably, called him a problem. His death didn't end his bloodline's ambition. Cleopatra's kingdom fell to his heir, Octavian, who made sure Caesarion's existence ended quietly. The lineage of Julius Caesar would continue not through love or heritage, but through legacy, a legal fiction so powerful it reshaped the world. Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor, inheriting not his uncle's temper, but his patience. It's poetic. Opened the gates. Augustus built the palace. From there, Caesar became a title, detached from personhood. Emperors wore it like a crown and a warning. Every Roman ruler, Gutherinsen, lived in his shadow. From Nero to Trajan, from Constantine to Justinian, all were pieces of him, recycled in marble and myth. The echoes spread farther. German emperors, centuries later, called themselves Kaisers. Russian monarchs chose Tsar. 2 languages, 2 continents, 1 ghostly root, Caesar. His name evolved into the sound of authority itself. Even when empires collapsed, the word endured, rolling through history like the aftershock of that single march across the Rubicon. And yet, for all that grandeur, it's hard not to picture the quieter image. An aging man writing letters by lamplight, scribbling notes for reforms, unaware that posterity will turn him into both God and warning. Caesar the reformer, Caesar the tyrant, Caesar the legend. Maybe he would have laughed. Maybe he would have said he planned it that way. There's a timeless irony in how the world remembers its conquerors. We forget the dust, the fear, the boredom between campaigns. We keep only the statue and the famous line. Et tu, brute, became the universal phrase for betrayal, said by millions of people who forget the man also invented a calendar and banned luxury carriages in Rome to reduce traffic. It's funny what sticks and what fades. So here he remains, suspended between fact and theater. Not saint, not sinner, just relentlessly ambitious. The true tragedy of Julius Caesar I sentee, that he was killed by friends, or that he ended a republic. It's that he believed, completely and calmly, that he was necessary, that Rome couldn't live without him. History proves he was both right and wrong. His world ended on the Senate floor. His idea built the next 1,000 years. Empires rose in his silhouette, each claiming they wouldn't make his mistake, until they did. Now, when we look back at his marble bust, smooth and expressionless, it's easy to forget that he laughed and stumbled and slept badly before battle, that he was human before he became history. But maybe that's the lesson. Immortality erases personality. The price of godhood is loneliness, carved in stone. So let the story rest here, between the heartbeat of an empire born from ambition and the silence of a man who became his own monument. Rome endures. His name endures. The Republic sleeps somewhere in the ashes. And Julius Caesar, restless still, stares from eternity with that faint, knowing smile, as if he's already heard the ending. Somewhere in the dusty sun of ancient Greece, centuries before anyone invented the concept of television sponsorships or medals shaped like drama masks, men started running in circles for the gods. Not metaphorically, literally, and everyone seemed to think that was a brilliant idea. This was the birth of the Olympics. No fireworks, no soundtracks, no stadium lights, just sweat, sand, and divine attention. We are in Olympia, somewhere around the year 776 BCE, or at least that's what later Greeks claimed when they went digging through memory and myth to find an official first time. Historians debate whether that date is exact or just convenient bookkeeping. But 776 BCE, it sounded nice, symmetrical, and ancient enough to be respectable. Back then, Greece wasn't one united country. It was a messy patchwork of city-states, each convinced they were the pinnacle of culture, and everyone else was obviously wrong. Athens had philosophers, Sparta had soldiers, Corinth had good pottery and bad politics, and everyone had opinions. But, for all their squabbling, the Greeks did share a few things: language, gods, athletic obsession, and a firm belief that public nudity and religious rituals could easily mix in one event. The Olympics began as part of a religious festival in honor of Zeus, the king of the gods, and arguably the most overbooked deity of them all. Olympia wasn't just a sports ground, it was sacred ground. The air was thick with incense, olive oil, and occasionally sweat heavy enough to be spiritual. The early games lasted one day. A single event. A foot race. The prize wasn't gold or silver or even a useful goat, just lasting fame and a wreath of olive leaves, which, by Greek standards, was glorious enough. The first recorded winner was Coroebus of Elis, a cook. Yes, the first Olympic champion was technically a chef who ran very fast. Humanity peaked early. Coroebus's speed immortalized him, though probably not his recipes. In the early years, that was just the stadion race, a sprint of about 200 meters, roughly the length of the stadium itself. Later, they added more races, double-length sprints, longer endurance runs, and eventually, events that made running look merciful: the pentathlon, wrestling, boxing, and the delightfully chaotic pancration, which was basically fight until you forget why. What we call sport, they called devotion. Athletes swore oaths to Zeus, sacrificed animals for his favor, and competed entirely naked. The word gymnasium itself comes from gymnos, meaning naked. For the Greeks, physical perfection wasn't just healthy, it was moral. The body was a temple, and if you were going to honor the gods, you'd better look like the architecture. Of course, not everyone appreciated the nude aesthetic. Foreign visitors often found the whole affair slightly awkward, but to the Greeks, it was pure ceremony, a celebration of divine creation through athletic symmetry. And also, probably, a good excuse to show off. Winners became instant celebrities. Their hometowns threw parades. Poets wrote odes. Sculptors carved their likeness in bronze. Families claimed divine ancestry for generations afterward. One victory could make your city famous. The Olympics were less about individual glory and more about civic pride. Winning meant the gods favored your entire polis. It was patriotism wrapped in olive oil. And yes, the Greeks oiled everything. Before Eben's athletes covered themselves in fine olive oil, both for spiritual reasons and, apparently, better sun protection. After competing, they scraped off the mix of oil and dust called glowios, which some enthusiastic fans actually collected as lucky charms. You could say they invented the first line of questionable sports memorabilia. Let's wander through a typical Olympic day for a spectator in 5th century BCE Greece. You'd rise early, possibly sleep-deprived after traveling days along dusty roads. Campsites sprawled everywhere around Olympia Cross, between a religious pilgrimage and a giant market. The air was a mix of roasted meat, prayers, and enthusiastic shouting in every regional accent imaginable. You'd see priests leading ceremonies before sculptures of Zeus, athletes warming up, stretching, and occasionally showing off in front of admiring crowds. Merchants selling bread, wine, garlands, and maybe a few questionable souvenirs. Meanwhile, dignitaries and philosophers walked around acting important and pretending they didn't bet on the races. When the events began, the crowd roared. Half praying, half guessing. In lieu of referees, officials known as *Hellenodikai*, kept order strictly, sometimes violently. Cheating was punished with lashes or public humiliation. Winners received cheers. Losers received existential reflection. Every 4 years, this spectacle stopped wars. Literally, Greece's many city-states lived in near-constant warfare. But during the games, a sacred truce called the *Ekacheria* went into effect. Armies paused, grudges rested, and roads became safe for travelers heading to Olympia. The fact that blood sacrifice was part of the schedule probably helped keep everyone honest. You can't really lie to Zeus when he's the guest of honor. The site of Olympia itself was stunning temples, altars, statues, and open fields of dusty gold earth. At its center stood the monumental Temple of Zeus, completed in the 5th century BC, housing one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. A gigantic statue of Zeus by Phidias, glimmering with gold and ivory. Imagine roaring crowds beneath it, chanting prayers before sprinting half-dressed through sacred dust. Religion and athletics were inseparable. The Olympics weren't entertainment, they were God service at high intensity. The athletes, though, weren't quite the amateur ideal we romanticize today. They were professionals by any other name. Training took years, often under specialized coaches in exclusive gymnasiums. Some rich city-states sponsored their athletes generously, seeing them as public relations assets. A single victory could secure pensions, fine dining, and lifelong applause. Ancient Greece was already running on the early prototype of celebrity culture. The events multiplied. A long-distance race, the *Dolikos*, tested stamina through heat and endurance. Hoplitodromos was a crowd favorite, men running fully armed in helmets and shields, looking like a fast-moving armory. Then came discus, javelin, wrestling, and boxing, where gloves were leather strips designed less for protection and more for making punches sound divine. And then the *Pancration*, which looked suspiciously like 2 men trying to invent mixed martial arts. Everything was allowed except biting and eye. The crowd loved it. The gods, presumably, did too. As centuries passed, Olympia became the beating heart of Greek identity. Wars, politics, and philosophies shifted, but the games endured. Poets like Pindar sanctified its victors in verses still studied 2 millennia later, describing athletes as close to gods in grace and courage. It was lofty language for people who spent half their day grappling half-naked in sand. But that was Greek idealism for you elevating chaos into art. Women, however, were banned from competing, and, in most cases, Aben watched. Married women caught attending risked execution, though unmarried ones were sometimes allowed to cheer discreetly. There was, to be fair, a counterpart to the Heraia Games for women, held in honor of Hera, Zeus's wife, shorter, smaller, and less glamorous, because patriarchy runs fast and never trips. Over time, Olympia became less about religious purity and more about human spectacle. Wealthier city-states began sending more elaborate entourages. Bribery crept in. Athletes switched allegiances for better pay. The sacred ideal slowly bent under human ambition because, when prestige meets ego, the divine always gets negotiated into branding. By the 5th century BCE, the Olympics had become an institution. Every 4 years, Greeks everywhere synchronized their calendars, legends, and expectations. Victories were recorded meticulously. Historians dated time itself by Olympiads' 4-year intervals marked by lists of champions. The Olympics weren't just a festival. They were the clock of Greek civilization. Let's drift to one of those afternoons when the games reached their height. The sun burns white on the sand. Trumpeters signal the next contest. The crowd surges forward, calling names, chanting gods. Somewhere, a philosopher sits cross-legged, muttering about moral virtue, while secretly hoping his favorite runner wins. Bronze statues of past victors glint along the route, reminders of endless ambition cast in eternal metal. And then there's the stillness before a race. No noise, just breath and heartbeat. The runner crouches, muscles tense, eyes fixed. The Hellenoticos drops his hand, shouts the signal, and they fly. Dust rises, sandals slap earth, and for one bright second, the crowd forgets politics, campaigns, and droughts. Even the gods, they say, lean forward to watch. When the victor crosses the line, holding arms to the sky, he's blessed with olive leaves and cheers that echo like small thunder. His name will be carved into stone, recited in temples, maybe sung by poets, too dramatic for their own good. And afterward, long after the festival ends, his hometown will repaint its gates, rename its squares, and brag endlessly that its boy once outran mortal men for the favor of Zeus. Let's float forward for the next part. The centuries, when the games expanded, spoiled a bit, and eventually collided headforce with Rome, kings, and the small matter of empire. If the early Olympic Games were a pure hymn to the gods, the later ones were more like a noisy street performance with good branding. Somewhere between heroism and sponsorships, the Games became a mirror of Greece itself. Brilliant, excessive, dramatic, and slightly exhausted. After centuries of glory, the Games didn't fade. They expanded. By the 4th century BCE, Olympia was hotter than ever. Every ambitious city-state wanted representation, every athlete wanted immortality, and every wealthy patron wanted to fund the next big winner. Somewhere under layers of incense and applause, the gods quietly became background noise. The sacred festival slowly turned into a national spectacle. Athletes still prayed. Of course, because superstition never retires, but the prayers smelled more like performance. Temples and altars multiplied, but so did hotels, markets, and pop-up vendors, selling everything from garlands to myths about your cousin's cousin winning bronze. And like all things successful, the Olympics began to attract politics. City-states used the podium as propaganda. Victories were paraded as proof of divine favor. Spartan runners were expected to look terrifying, Athenian wrestlers philosophical, and Corinthian boxers wealthy enough to bruise elegantly. The Games had moved far beyond sport. They were now diplomacy, tourism, and theater in one tunic. Let's float into one of those later festivals. Say around 300 BCE, Rome was still a minor curiosity across the sea. Alexander's empire had fractured, and Greek pride survived, mostly through culture. Olympia remained neutral ground, a sanctuary of nostalgia. Athletes arrived from everywhere: Syracuse, Rhodes, Athens, even from colonies scattered around the Mediterranean. The stands were packed. Poets introduced their work between events. Philosophers gave live lectures on moral discipline, while surrounded by very sweaty people punching each other. It was, in its own way, a masterpiece of contradiction. But with popularity came corruption. Stories began to circulate about bribes, quiet deals behind temple walls, promises whispered in olive groves. Entire city-states competed not through athletes, but through coin purses. When an athlete was caught cheating, his fine-funded statues of Zeus, known as *Zanes*, grim monuments, lining the entrance path, each inscribed with the offender's name. Visitors called them the Warning Walk, a nice blend of morality and marketing. Then came the professionals. The amateur ideal had officially packed up. Greek athletes started training full-time, sponsored by their cities, with diets and coaches and publicists before publicists existed. Victories brought pensions, free meals for life, an instant celebrity. The same public that once worshipped divine strength now gossiped about star athletes, diets, and personal lives. Humanity, it seems, never changes much. One of those celebrities was Leonidas of Rhodes, a runner who dominated 4 consecutive Olympiads from 164 to 152 BCE. He won 12 Olive Rithsan, outrageously unbroken record lasting over 2,000 years. He competed in sprints, distance races, and even the armed run, carrying full armor in blistering heat. He outlived rivals, regimes, and probably shame itself. When people talk about athletic immortality, they might as well be quoting his training manual. But time, as always, eats everything. By the 2nd century BCE, Greece's political independence was collapsing. The Macedonians had long ruled most Greek territories, and Rome was starting to loom across the horizon. Organized and very interested in using Greek culture as decoration for its empire. Greek art, philosophy, and literature fascinated Rome. Their food, olive oil, and architecture spread across the Mediterranean, and inevitably, so did their games. Rome didn't destroy the Olympics, it absorbed them. When Roman generals arrived, they admired the spectacle but struggled to understand the naked oaths to Zeus. They saw practical use instead. The emperors sponsored games as demonstrations of imperial grace. Athletic competition turned into a tool of loyalty. Caesar and later emperors handed out donations to Olympians, calling it diplomacy wrapped in olive wreaths. Still, Roman values mixed awkwardly with Greek idealism. The Romans loved strength, but adored spectacle even more. They preferred chariots and gladiators bloodier, louder affairs that smelled of empire rather than piety. So, when they borrowed the Olympics, they kept the ceremonies, but changed the spirit. Athletes now competed less for Zeus and more for applause. Olympia became tourism with an altar attached. Spectators multiplied. Wealthy Romans built villas nearby, hosting parties during the games. Poets like Pausanias visited centuries later and described the ruins and statues already decaying, proof that nostalgia had moved faster than maintenance. The Temple of Zeus still stood, but scavengers eyed its gold plates like magpies. At the same time, the athletes themselves began to shift from heroes to entertainers. Philosophers quietly sighed about the decline of morality. Stoics complained that competitors cared more for glory than virtue, while cynics pointed out that nobody ever protested at the hot food stalls. Cynics have always had the easiest job. The Romans did contribute something. Infrastructure and organization. They repaired roads leading to Olympia, built water systems, and spread the festival's fame beyond Greece. Writers like Plutarch and Lucian recorded colorful tales of the events, half sport, half comedy. One report describes a runner collapsing from heat while his competitors tripped over him, which, to be fair, is still relatable. Modern entertainment. Religion evolved too. Zeus's supremacy faded as new cults spread. Apollo, Dionysus, even Egyptian gods imported for novelty. But the Olympic truce continued. Armies still declared peace for the duration of the games because, apparently, politics feared bad publicity even then. The decline was slow, gradual, almost polite. Olympia survived invasions, droughts, and earthquakes, always limping back with another ceremony. But the character had changed. Where once athletes prayed for divine favor, now they prayed their patrons wouldn't cut sponsorships. Rome had made the sacred secular and nowhere felt it more than the stadium. By the time Nero arrived in the 1st century CE, the Olympics were fully Nero adored Greece, mostly for how effortlessly it admired his ego. In 67, Seheven entered the games personally. Claiming victory in every event, he joined, including chariot racing, which he won despite famously falling off. When you're emperor, physics are optional. The locals smiled, clapped, and declared him champion of everything. Because what else do you do when Nero demands applause? Olympia's sacred soil had officially become a stage. Yet even in this absurdity, something resistant remained. The rituals, the races, and that same stubborn rhythm of 4 years continued. People still gathered. They still believed that competing under the open sky, dust and sweat mixing with prayer, made them part of something eternal. The games outlived Nero, the Flavian dynasty, and even Rome's peak. But not forever. As centuries passed, new faiths rose. Christianity spread, and with it, suspicion of pagan rituals, The Olympics, still dedicated to Zeus, started to look less like cultural heritage and more like heresy. By the 4th century CE, Emperor Theodosius, a devout Christian, outlawed pagan festivals altogether. Olympia fell silent. The last recorded Olympic Games took place around 393 CE, after more than 1,000 years of existence. Not bad for an event that started as a single The temples were plundered, the statues melted or toppled, earthquakes buried what remained. For centuries, the site vanished beneath layers of mud and myth. Travelers guessed where it might have been, some placing Olympia near the sea, others insisting it was mere legend. The sanctuary of Zeus, once alive with trumpets and olive crowns, became a quiet ruin scattered with goats. It took rediscovery in the modern era, centuries later, for anyone to breathe life back into that dust. Archaeologists would uncover columns, pedestals, racetrack echoes of the old games waiting patiently under the soil. The gods may have left, but the ghosts of the runners lingered, and so the original Olympics ended not with applause, but with silenza, slow fade, like sunlight slipping off marble. But, as the 19th century would prove, legends rarely stay buried. The world would try again, centuries later, in modern suits and sneakers, under the same banner, still pretending that sweat and hope can make humans divine for a moment. Let's float to that rebirth. Next, the century when ancient glory met industrial ambition, and the Olympics were reinvented. Not for gods this time, but for nations. After 15 centuries of silence, the fields of Olympia lay baking quietly under the Greek sun. The gods had gone, the temples were broken, the athletes had long since become myth, but somewhere in the 19th century, that curious age of steam engines, nationalism, and accidental idealism, someone decided that running in circles for glory needed a comeback. Because humanity, it seems, cannot resist dressing nostalgia in new uniforms. The dream began with scholars. Europe had rediscovered Greece the way people rediscover old romance novels, with too much enthusiasm and selective reading. Archaeologists, poets, and academics became obsessed with the idea of reviving what they imagined as the pure, uncorrupted spirit of ancient Greece. Of course, real ancient Greece had been very human, sweaty, political, and occasionally bribed, but nostalgia rarely checks its sources. By the mid-1800s, German excavations at Olympia unearthed temples, altars, and stadium remnants. The ruins stirred something grand in Victorian hearts. Europe, tired of wars, yet addicted to competition, found itself dreaming of unity through sport, a kind of civilized duel wrapped in olive leaves. And right on cue appeared Pierre de Coubertin, a man with the energy of 20 reformers and the hair to match it. Born in France in 1863, Coubertin was a historian, educator, and firm believer that team games could save civilization. He looked at Europe and saw too many bored aristocrats sitting around writing essays about decline. His solution, physical education, or, less poetically, civilized running. Coubertin became convinced that reviving the Olympic Games could unite nations, strengthen youth, and, quite possibly, make people nicer. It was optimistic, almost adorably so. He visited England, studied British schools, admired their sports culture, and returned to France ready to preach athletic utopia. Of course, nobody immediately listened. Most thought he was being romantic, but Coubertin kept going, hosting conferences, writing letters, making speeches with titles like Physical Exercise and Moral Improvement. You could say he was both visionary and mildly obsessed. In 1894, he finally assembled an international congress in Paris. Academics, sportsmen, aristocrats, anyone who might care. After much discussion and polite enthusiasm, they agreed. The Olympic Games would be reborn, the chosen site for the first edition. Fittingly, Athens. 2 years later, in 1896, under flickering electric lights and hesitant hope, the modern Olympics officially began. Athens was a mixture of ruins and rapid modernity. The Panathenaic Stadium, newly rebuilt, entirely out of marble, gleamed like a monument reborn. The Greek government, though nearly bankrupt, embraced the games as national redemption. Citizens cheered. Foreign guests admired everything. Meanwhile, organizers half panicked behind the scenes, wondering if the whole thing would collapse from overconfidence. The first modern Olympics looked grander than it truly was, but charm covered the cracks. There were 241 male athletes from 14 countries, competing in 43 events. No women, no sponsorships, no microphones, not even standard scoring systems. Officials mostly shouted results, and referees improvised rules as they went. It was chaos, but dignified chaos. Track events were the backbone. The 100 meters, 400 meters, and the marathon, that last one inspired by the ancient legend of a messenger dying gloriously after running from Marathon to Athens. Greeks adored that story. So when Spiridon Louis, a quiet water carrier from a village outside Athens, won the first marathon in 2 hours and 58 minutes, the crowd lost its mind. He was an ordinary man turned hero, proof that Greece had given birth to glory once, and could still do it again. And that, really, was the emotional success of the first Olympics. Not the medals or the organization, but the feeling. An echo of the old Greek festival, reborn in an industrial world that desperately needed meaning. Coubertin himself didn't compete or coach. He orchestrated. While chaos unfolded in the stadium, he quietly scribbled notes for improvement. He saw not a fluke, but a beginning. And he was right. Each new edition after that grew. Paris 1900, St. Louis 1900, Quattro London 1908. Each one more elaborate, occasionally more disastrous, but undeniably alive. By 1912, the Olympics had gained their rhythm. Athletes now arrived from 5 continents. The famous Olympic rings, representing those continents linked in harmony, made their debut soon after. Of course, harmony didn't last. 20 years later, half the nations would be at war, because nothing ruins sportsmanship like geopolitics. Still, for those brief stretches of peace, the games worked. They gave people something to cheer for that didn't involve battle. And while ancient Olympia had burned sacrifices, modern stadiums burned electricity and nationalism in equal measure. The early 20th century Olympics weren't exactly egalitarian dreams. They were aristocratic, controlled by men who thought amateurism meant excluding anyone poor enough to need payment. Coubertin himself resisted women's participation, warning that their inclusion would be impractical and unaesthetic. Translation: women might ruin the tone. Thankfully, the games eventually outgrew that particular nonsense, though not quickly enough. Between 1900 and 1928, women were gradually allowed to compete, first in tennis, golf, and sailing, then in others. By mid-century, they were running, swimming, fencing, pressing weights, and winning everything previously labeled unsuitable. Zeus probably would have approved. Through it all, the games kept mutating. Between idealism and marketing, between peace and propaganda, they became their own small world. Cities competed to host them. Politicians used them for display. Athletes became living emblems of national pride, burdened and celebrated by people they'd never met. And yet, beneath the flags and politics, something oddly ancient persisted. That mix of ritual and performance. The torch relay, introduced in 1936, turned a new tradition into a myth instantly. A flame lit in Olympia traveled across borders, carried by runners until it reached the host city. It was pure invention, yet it felt ancient. The sight of fire uniting modern nations timeless, and filmed in glorious black and white. Of course, the same 1936 Olympics, held in Berlin, revealed how easily idealism could be weaponized. The stadium was magnificent, but the ideology was monstrous. The Nazis choreographed the event, like theater supreme athletes. Perfect bodies, political purity. It was propaganda, disguised as celebration. But reality intervened beautifully when Jesse Owens, an African-American sprinter, won 4 golds under Hitler's gaze. The crowd cheered anyway. Whatever Berlin wanted the games to be, the athletes quietly rewrote it. The decades that followed turned the Olympics into an institution part sports festival, part global ritual, and occasionally part disaster management exercise. Wars paused them, sponsors revived them, scandals scarred them. Every few years, humanity gathered again to pretend that competition could also mean unity. And somehow, despite everything, it still worked. The Olympics survived 2 world wars, boycotts, and political theater. They survived commercialization, doping, and Twitter. They even survived us, remembering that the ancient ones ended badly. The flame kept being lit. The runners kept running. And the same human belief that glory, fairness, and spectacle can all coexist kept the dream alive. There's something comforting in that. We've replaced temples with arenas, priests with commentators, olive wreaths with medals, but the ritual beneath is identical. We still gather every 4 years. We still cheer strangers like gods. We still measure worth with distance run and seconds counted. And perhaps we still hope that, for those moments, we can be something better, faster, higher, stronger, if only briefly. Maybe that's the quiet genius of the Olympics, ancient or modern. They don't really promise peace. They promise destruction that feels like peace. Nations applaud each other's athletes, pretending competition equals friendship. And for a few weeks, the world believes it. That illusion alone might be worth keeping sacred, so the story circles back, like the runners themselves, to the beginning. The dust of Olympia still clings to every track, every medal, every opening ceremony, where fireworks try to outshine the old flame. Nations chant, chimeras flash, and somewhere, if mythology allows, Zeus probably nods from his forgotten temple, amused that humans haven't changed much after all, from gods to marble, from ruins to stadiums. The Olympics have always represented the same thing: our fondness for turning effort into meaning. What began as a sprint for divine approval became a marathon of human hope. The torch never really died. It just moved hands, and as the final applause fades, maybe it's best to imagine one last scene. A lone runner in that ancient sanctuary, dust on his feet, sunlight on old stone. No crowd, no anthem, no cameras, just breath, heartbeat, and that quiet moment when striving feels holy again. Because that's what the Olympics were always about. Not victory, but the beautiful madness of trying. Everyone. Tonight, we're heading back to Florence, a city that, back in the 1400s, was basically the Wi-Fi router of Europe. If anything brilliant happened, it probably connected through Florence first. So dim your lights, maybe grab some tea or a goblet of Chianti if you're really committing to the theme, and let us slowly drift into the story of a family that turned money into art, politics into power, and reputation into, well, centuries of drama. This is the story of the Medici. Bankers, patrons, puppet masters, and occasionally, the reason half of Europe had a headache. But before they were the rich and fabulous overlords of Renaissance culture, they were just another merchant family trying to climb out of medieval mediocrity. The early Medici weren't born into ancient nobility. Nope, they bought their way in, politely. Of course, with the quiet confidence of people who knew that money talks, and sometimes commissions a Botticelli painting to do the talking for you. Let's float back to the late 1200s. Florence at this time wasn't all marble palaces and genius artists. It was mostly chaos. The kind of chaos where banking families hired mercenaries, and neighbors occasionally set each other's houses on fire over minor political disagreements. The city was divided between 2 rival factions: the Guelphs, who supported the Pope, and the Gip, who backed the Holy Roman Emperor. Think of it like a medieval version of Team iPhone versus Team Android, except with swords and much worse hygiene. The Medicis started out on the Guelph side, because why not pick the faction with better access to PayPal business? Their early fortune came from banking and wool, the 2 Florentine obsessions. They weren't the biggest name in town yet, but they were networking hard. Enter Giovanni Vixi de' Medici. Giovanni is basically the first Medici you need to remember. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't even particularly charismatic. He was just calm, calculating, and quietly brilliant, like a chess player who S3 moves ahead while everyone else is still arguing about the rules. Born around 1360, Giovanni grew up during one of Florence's more turbulent phases, which, honestly, is saying something, because turbulent was the city's default setting. His father, Averardo, had dabbled in politics and business, but it was Giovanni who transformed the family into something much bigger. He founded the Medici Bank around 1397. And not to be dramatic, but this bank basically funded the Renaissance. Imagine if one private company handled everyone's money, kings, nobles, the church, and also decided what art was cool. That was the Medici Bank. Giovanni had a simple philosophy: make money, but do it with style. He kept the Medici name clean. No shady business, no reckless gambling. In Florence, where bankers were about as trustworthy as modern crypto influencers, that was quite the achievement. And, crucially, he knew the golden rule of Renaissance economics. If you want to get rich, get close to God. So Giovanni became the papal banker. That's right. The Pope himself trusted him with the Vatican's money. Imagine being the guy who handles the Pope's checking account. That's how deep the Medici got. Giovanni's strategy worked. Slowly, quietly, he turned Florence into a Medici playground. A stayed humble, or at least pretended to. He avoided showing off wealth too blatantly, because in Florence, flaunting your fortune was basically an invitation for everyone else to accuse you of corruption. So, while rival families built marble mansions, Giovanni lived modestly, at least by Renaissance billionaire standards. When he died in 1429, Giovanni left behind an empire of money, influence, and a very solid family name. But his greatest legacy wasn't wealth, it was his sons. Specifically, Cosimo de' Medici, Cosimo, the man who made quiet domination into an art form. Cosimo wasn't your typical flashy Renaissance prince. He didn't wear crowns or command armies. He just controlled everyone who did. If Giovanni was the architect of the Medici rise, Cosimo was the decorator who added gold trim to every corner of Florence. Let's set the scene. Florence, early 1400s. A city obsessed with money, art, and politics, in that order. The Republican government pretended to value equality, but behind the curtains, rich families pulled the strings. Cosimo was one of those string pullers. Except he did it so gracefully that most people thanked him while he was doing it. He inherited the Medici Bank from his father and expanded it into a continental powerhouse. Branches in Rome, Venice, London, Geneva. If you were important, you probably owed Cosimo money. And if you owed Cosimo money, you probably also owed him favors. Cosimo had an incredible sense of balance, like a political acrobat walking a tightrope over a pit of daggers. He was rich enough to intimidate people, but not arrogant enough to make them unite against him. He funded public projects, churches, libraries, convents, not because he was purely charitable, but because it made everyone like him. It's hard to criticize a man who just paid for your city's new cathedral dome. Speaking of which, that dome, the dome of the Florence Cathedral, designed by Filippo Brunelleschi, was one of Cosimo's greatest investments. The city had been trying to figure out how to top their unfinished cathedral for decades, but no one knew how to build a dome that big without it collapsing. Enter Brunelleschi, a genius architect who was equal parts brilliant and insufferable. Cosimo backed him financially, which was a bold move, because Brunelleschi's ideas sounded insane at the time, but the gamble paid off. The dome was finished. It didn't fall down, and suddenly Florence looked like the capital of human achievement. Cosimo became the man who literally crowned the city. And with that his influence became untouchable. But, of course, not everyone was thrilled about one man quietly running the city. Florence had a weird relationship with power. It wanted stability, but pretended to love democracy. So, naturally, Cosimo made enemies. His biggest rival was Rinaldo degli Albizzi, a man with the charming energy of a guy who hates you but insists on inviting you to dinner. Rinaldo accused Cosimo of trying to take over Florence and managed to get him arrested in 1433. The charge, attempting to dominate the state, which, to be fair, was technically true. Cosimo was thrown in a tower and nearly executed. But here is where his genius really showed. Even in prison, Cosimo bribed the guards, bought influence, and basically managed his empire from a cell. When the political winds shifted a year later, the Albizzi were exiled, and Cosimo returned not just as a free man, but as the undisputed ruler of Florence. He didn't need a crown. He had something better control over the economy, the church, and the minds of Florence's intellectual elite. From that point on, Cosimo ruled behind the scenes. People called him Pater Patria, father of the fatherland, which sounds noble, but was really just a polite way of saying guy who owns everything. He surrounded himself with brilliant artists, philosophers, architects. He funded Donatello, Fra Angelico, and a young guy named Michelangelo would later benefit from the Medici legacy. He basically invented the concept of rich people sponsoring culture to seem classy. But for all his power, Cosimo kept his tone modest. He dressed simply, spoke softly, and never built a palace that screamed dictator. Though, to be fair, his house was still enormous. By the time he died in 1464, Florence was effectively his kingdom. The Republic still existed on paper, but everyone knew who was in charge. And yet, like most dynasties, the next generation brought, let's say, complications. Cosimo, Ison, Piero. The Medici inherited both the fortune and the problems. Piero was nicknamed the Gouty, which already tells you how his life went. He was perpetually sick, constantly wrapped in blankets, and probably not thrilled about running a city from bed. He did his best to hold things together. But without Cosimo's charm or subtlety, it wasn't easy. He ruled for only 5 years before his death in 1469, but in that short time he did manage one impressive thing. He passed the Medici Empire to his son, a charming, ambitious, and maybe slightly overconfident young man named Lorenzo. And that, my friends, is where the real spectacle begins. Because if Cosimo built the Medici Empire, and Piero tried to survive it, Lorenzo was about to perform it. Let us drift into that golden glow of the late 1400s, a time when Florence was the cultural capital of the world, thanks almost entirely to one man known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. Hey there, still awake? Or maybe just barely, which is perfect. Tonight, we drift further into Florence, into candlelit halls and perfumed gardens, into the sound of lute music echoing through marble courtyards. The city is rich, restless, and glowing with genius, and right in the center of it all sits Lorenzo de' Medici, the man who somehow managed to make running a city look like throwing a very long, very expensive party. Now, Lorenzo wasn't supposed to be a ruler in the traditional sense. Florence was still officially a republic. You couldn't just call yourself a prince. That would have been tacky. But everyone knew the Medici were in charge. It was like one of those group projects where everyone's name is on the paper, but only one person actually did the work. Lorenzo inherited power in 1469 at the age of 20, after his father Piero, the Gouty, passed away. And right from the start, he seemed too good at this. He was handsome, educated, athletic, the Renaissance equivalent of the guy who gets invited to every dinner party and writes poetry in Latin for fun. He could debate philosophy, commission art, and negotiate treaties, sometimes all in the same afternoon. The Florentines loved him, or at least loved what he represented: confidence, beauty, and a sense that their city was the center of the universe. And to be fair, under Lorenzo, it kind of was. Florence in the glow picture it. Florence around 1470. The streets are narrow, the buildings are packed tight, and every corner seems to house a genius. Painters, sculptors, architects, all funded by Lorenzo's overflowing wallet. This was the height of the Renaissance, and Lorenzo was its golden sponsor. He didn't just fund art, he collected minds. The Medici Palace became a magnet for philosophers, poets, and scholars. There was Marsilio, who translated Plato and talked endlessly about divine love, basically turning Neoplatonism into a Florentine lifestyle brand. Then there was Pico della Mirandola, a prodigy who once claimed he could debate any topic in the world. Lorenzo just smiled and said, "Sure, go ahead." And of course, there were the artists, Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci. Lorenzo saw art not just as decoration, but as a tool, a way to turn Florence into something immortal. His patronage wasn't about taste. It was strategy. Art was politics in marble form. When Botticelli painted the birth of Venus, it wasn't just mythological whimsy, it was Florence showing off. Look, It seemed to say, "We so cultured we can turn pagan goddesses into Christian metaphors and hang them over our fireplaces." The Medici myth, Lorenzo didn't rule by force, he ruled by myth. He was the embodiment of Florence's self-image. Sophisticated, artistic, and just a little smug, he threw massive festivals, parades, poetry readings, tournaments, all designed to make people forget that their republic was basically a one-family show. He'd ride through town dressed in silk, smiling modestly while secretly knowing he controlled everything from the price of bread to who got to join the city council, and, to his credit, he managed it all with an almost supernatural calm. Even when politics got messy, and oh, they did, he somehow floated above it. Serene and unbothered, like a man who knew history would remember him fondly. But, as it turns out, not everyone appreciated the Medici monopoly on magnificence. The Pazzi problem enter. The Pazzi family, rich, ambitious, and deeply irritated that they weren't the Medici. Now, Florence had plenty of rival families. The Albizzi, the Strozzi, the Soderini, but the Pazzi were different. They weren't just jealous. They were vengeful. The Medici dominated banking, politics, and society, and the Pazzi were tired of smiling politely about it. So they came up with a plan. A very bad one, but also very dramatic. In 1478, during High Mass at the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, inside the church, they tried to assassinate Lorenzo and his brother, Giuliano de' Medici. Because nothing says Holy Day like attempted murder at the altar, the idea was simple. Kill both brothers at once, blame someone else, and take over Florence. Unfortunately for the Pazzi, things didn't go exactly as planned. Giuliano was stabbed to death brutally, but Lorenzo survived, thanks to quick reflexes, luck, and maybe divine intervention. He locked himself in the sacristy while chaos erupted outside, and when the dust settled, the Medici response was not merciful. The Florentine people, loyal to Lorenzo and slightly obsessed with revenge, hunted down the conspirators. Several Pazzi family members were killed, others were hanged from the windows of the Palazzo Vecchio. Lorenzo, in his calm, poised way, let it all happen. He didn't have to shout. His enemies just disappeared. After that, no one doubted who ran Florence. Lorenzo's balancing act, the assassination attempt, changed Lorenzo. He became more cautious, more calculating. He realized that beauty and art alone couldn't protect him. Power needed politics, and politics needed precision. He strengthened alliances across Italy, kept the Pope somewhat happy, and turned diplomacy into an art form. When Pope Sixtus IV tried to ruin him economically because, yes, the Pope had been low-key involved in the Pazzi conspiracy, Lorenzo didn't start a war. He just charmed his way through it. In one of the more impressive moves of the era, he personally went to Naples to negotiate with King Ferrante, who had been threatening Florence. Everyone thought Lorenzo was signing his own death warrant. Ferrante was notorious for feeding enemies to his pet lions, but Lorenzo walked in, talked for days, and walked out with a peace treaty. No lions involved. From then on, people called him Lorenzo the Magnificent, a nickname he didn't choose, but definitely didn't correct. Patron of everything back home, he kept building Florence's legend. He expanded libraries, founded the Platonic Academy, and sponsored scholars who shaped humanism for centuries. His home was filled with books, sculptures, and the faint sound of constant debate about the meaning of beauty and virtue. He supported a teenage Michelangelo, letting him study the Medici garden statues, which, yes, is how Michelangelo learned to make stone look like flesh. Imagine being so casually rich that you're just raising the next great artist in your backyard. Lorenzo also wrote poetry, because of course he did. And not bad poetry either, though. To be fair, when you're the most powerful man in Italy, everyone tells you your poems are good, but power has a price. And here's the quiet tragedy of Lorenzo's story. He built beauty on a foundation of debt. The Medici Bank, once the envy of Europe, began to crumble under his watch. Lorenzo was a visionary, but not exactly a financial genius. He spent freely on art, on politics, on keeping Florence's image polished, and slowly, the empire his grandfather built started to crack. Branches of the Medici Bank closed across Europe. Mismanagement, corruption, and risky loans caught up to them, but Lorenzo couldn't stop. The image had to stay perfect. Florence had to keep shining, even if it was all on borrowed gold. By the 1490s, his health was failing. Like his father, he suffered from gout, and probably other ailments no Renaissance doctor could properly diagnose. He retreated to his villa in Correggi, surrounded by books and the lost loyal friends who hadn't been bought or banished. And there, in 1492, yes, the same year, Columbus sailed off to accidentally discover a new world. Lorenzo the Magnificent died quietly. At 40, the end of the Golden Glow, his death was more than personal tragedy. It was the end of an era. Florence lost its balancing force. The city that had glowed with confidence under Lorenzo's charm soon slid into chaos. His son, Piero, the Unfortunate, yes, that is his actual nickname, inherited the mess and handled it about as well as you'd expect someone called the Unfortunate to handle anything. Within a few years, the Medici were exiled from Florence, replaced by a theocratic regime led by a fire and brimstone preacher named who believed luxury was sin and promptly started burning paintings. So much for the Renaissance sparkle. But, of course, the Medici story doesn't end there. Oh no. They had a habit of coming back from exile like it was a family tradition. In the next drift of our journey, we'll follow the exiled heirs, the scheming popes, and the slow transformation of the Medici from humble bankers into full-blown monarchs, complete with crowns, scandals, and portraits that look suspiciously smug. Because, as we'll see, you can kick a Medici out of Florence, but you can't keep them away from power for long. Again, let's sink a little deeper into the Renaissance haze, you know, that soft candlelight glow mixed with the faint smell of incense, oil paint, and probably a bit of political anxiety. Florence, after all, was rarely calm. When Lorenzo the Magnificent died in 1492, it was as if the lights dimmed across the whole city. The Golden Boy was gone, and in his place stood his son, Piero de' Medici, or as history, somewhat cruelly, nicknamed him Piero de un Fortunate. Now, the Unfortunate wasn't entirely fair. Piero wasn't a villain. He was just unprepared. He grew up in luxury, surrounded by poets and artists, not schemers and assassins. He probably thought ruling Florence would be like hosting an endless party. But the world had changed, and the music had stopped. Europe in the 1490s was shifting fast. France had a new, overconfident king, Charles VIII, who had just decided he wanted to invade Italy. Because, well, why not? Everyone was doing a little light conquering in those days. When Charles marched his army across the Alps in 1494, Italy panicked. Florence, as usual, was caught in the middle. Piero was supposed to protect the city's independence, but instead, he made a deal with the invaders. A bad one. He basically gave away key fortresses to the French without consulting anyone. The Florentines were furious. They didn't mind dictatorship when it came with pageants and art, but handing the city over to foreigners, that crossed the line. The people rose up. The Medici palaces were looted, and Piero was forced to flee barefoot. If you believe the gossip, though that might just be poetic exaggeration, either way, the Medici were out, exiled once again. Just like in the old days, Florence declared itself free, and in the vacuum of power, a new figure emerged. Girolamo Savonarola. Savonarola was a Dominican friar with the emotional range of a thunderstorm. He preached that Florence had become corrupt, that its art, beauty, and luxury were sinful distractions from God, which, given that this was the city of Botticelli and humanism, went down about as well as a lecture on modesty at a masquerade ball. But the people, reeling from war and uncertainty, listened. He became the moral dictator of Florence, banning dancing fancy clothes, even playing cards. And, most famously, he organized the Bonfire of the Vanities, where citizens were encouraged to throw their sinful possessions into flames. Paintings, jewelry, books, anything that hinted at luxury went up in smoke. It was like Florence decided to set fire to its own soul. But the thing about moral purity movements is, they don't last. By 1498, Savonarola had alienated the Pope, the rich, and eventually everyone else. He was excommunicated, tortured, and burned in the same public square where his bonfires once raged. And with that the pendulum swung again. Florence was free, but rudderless. The Medici were still gone, scattered across Europe, living in borrowed palaces, quietly plotting their return. The family in exile. Exile for the Medici wasn't exactly miserable. They still had money. Not as much as before, but enough to keep them in comfort. They stayed connected, networking with kings, cardinals, and anyone who might be useful. The real advantage of being a Medici was that everyone still wanted something from you. And in 1513, after nearly 20 years in the wilderness, the family finally staged their comeback. The man who brought them home wasn't a warrior or a politician, but a clergyman, Giovanni de' Medici, the second son of Lorenzo. The magnificent Giovanni had entered the church young, as was tradition for spare sons in rich families. He was made a cardinal at 13, because apparently the Renaissance was very casual about qualifications. But beneath the silk robes, Giovanni was a true Medici, clever, charming, and quietly ambitious. When the political winds shifted thanks to some favorable alliances and a bit of French help, the Medici returned to Florence, and Giovanni became the city's unofficial ruler. But he didn't stop there. In 1513, Giovanni was elected Pope Leo X. Yes, a Medici was now sitting on the papal throne. It was the ultimate flex. From merchants to monarchs of Christendom, the family had officially leveled up. Pope Leo VI, the lavish Pope Leo VI, was everything you'd expect from a Renaissance pope. Extravagant, cultured, and blissfully unconcerned about budgets. His motto might as well have been God will provide. But the bankers will handle the details. He spent money like it was a spiritual duty. Banquets, art commissions, tapestrious musicians, feasts. Rome under Leo was one long festival. He famously said, "God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." Which is not exactly what the Church Fathers had in mind. He poured fortunes into rebuilding St. Peter's Basilica, turning it into the grand monument we know today. The architecture was stunning, the art magnificent, and the bills astronomical. To fund his lavishness, the Vatican began selling indulgences certificates promising forgiveness of sins for a price. It was a familiar practice, but under Leo, it exploded. The money rolled in, but so did criticism. One German monk in particular, a rather stubborn fellow named Martin Luther, was so furious about indulgences that he nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in 1517. And just like that, the Reformation began. So yes, you could say a Medici pope helped spark the greatest religious schism in European history. A bit awkward, but very on brand for a family that turned everything they touched into both brilliance and chaos. Leo's papacy was glorious, but it burned fast. By 1521, he was dead, probably from malaria, though rumors claimed he'd died of overeating. Either way, the Vatican treasury was empty, and Europe was on fire with reform. Clement VII. The other Medici pope, you'd think that would be enough drama for one family, but the Medici weren't done. Another cousin, Giulio de' Medici, soon followed Leo's path to the papacy, becoming Pope Clement VII in 1523. Clement was clever, refined, and chronically indecisive, not ideal traits for a man trying to hold the Catholic Church together during a full-blown crisis. The political landscape was terrifying. France and Spain were fighting over Italy. The Reformation was spreading, and everyone wanted a piece of the papal pie. Clement tried to play both sides, supporting whoever seemed strongest at the moment. It was a very Florentine move, but it didn't end well. In 1527, the emperor's troops, mercenaries from Germany and Spain, marched on Rome. Many of them were unpaid, angry, and Protestant. What followed was the sack of Rome, one of the darkest moments of the Renaissance. The city was looted, churches desecrated, priests murdered. The Pope himself had to flee to Castel Sant'Angelo and hide. It was a humiliating disaster, and Clement never fully recovered his authority. Florence under siege again. Meanwhile, Florence, sensing weakness in the Medici, expelled them again. The city restored its republic and celebrated freedom, briefly believing it could live without its old puppet masters. That illusion didn't last. Clement, still Pope, used his power to crush the rebellion. In 1530, imperial troops besieged Florence for nearly a year. The city starved, fought, and finally surrendered. It was the end of the Republic for good. The Medici returned, this time not as bankers or patrons, but as hereditary rulers. The family's dream of true nobility had finally come true, though it came wrapped in the smell of smoke and betrayal. Clement installed his young relative, Alessandro de' Medici, as Duke of Florence, the city's first monarch. Alessandro was half Medici, half African. His mother was likely a servant or enslaved woman, and while that made him unique among European nobles, it also made him a target. His reign was brief, marked by suspicion and scandal. In 1537, he was murdered by another cousin, Lorenzino de' Medici. Because, of course, the Medici could never resist a little intra-family drama. Lorenzino claimed he did it for liberty, but fled immediately after, spending the rest of his life writing excuses in France. After Alessandro's death, power passed to Cosimo de' Medici, not to be confused with the earlier Cosimo, the wise banker. This was Cosimo, a distant relative who would turn out to be one of the family's most formidable rulers. He was young, serious, and surprisingly capable. At 17, most teenagers are trying to figure out what to do with their lives. Cosimo decided to take control of an entire duchy, and because he was a Medici, he succeeded. Under his rule, Florence transformed again, less a republic, more a polished autocracy. Cosimo expanded the city's borders, built fortresses, sponsored scholars, and in a very Renaissance move, commissioned portraits of himself, looking incredibly dignified. He married Eleanor of Toledo, a Spanish noblewoman whose poise and fortunes stabilized the dynasty. Together, they became the Renaissance power couple, elegant, disciplined, and prolific. They had 11 children, because dynasties run on numbers. Cosimo eventually received the title Grand Duke of Tuscany from the Pope, meaning that the family that had once started as humble wool merchants now officially ruled most of central Italy. It was the ultimate comeback. From exiles to popes to princes, the Medici had climbed every possible rung of the ladder, and if they occasionally stepped on a few people along the way, well, that was just Renaissance business as usual. But power, as always, came with its own slow decay. The later generations of the Medici would be less brilliant, more decadent, and far more tragic. The long, sleepy sunset of a family that had burned too bright for too long. So, as the candles flicker low and the marble palaces fade into shadow, let's drift onward, toward the final act, where Medici dukes and duchesses lived out their gilded dramas in slow motion, trapped in luxury, loneliness, and the echoes of their ancestors' glory. So, here we are again, floating down the marble corridors of Florence, where the air is still thick with oil paint, incense, and the faint hum of a family that refuses to fade quietly. The Medici are no longer bankers, or even just dukes. By now, they're proper royals wearing crowns, signing decrees, and pretending they aren't still haunted by the ghosts of their past ambitions. The glory days of Lorenzo the Magnificent are long gone. The Renaissance, that glittering explosion of art and intellect, is giving way to something colder, heavier, more baroque. The paintings get darker, the wigs get taller, and the politics get, well, still terrible, honestly. At the center of it all is Cosimo I de' Medici, the teenager who took over a city and somehow managed to keep it in one piece. By the time we meet him here, he's no longer the fresh-faced boy from the countryside. He's a duke, hard-edged, composed, and fully aware that Florence is no longer a republic, no matter how politely it pretends. Cosimo is the kind of ruler who believes in control, absolute, meticulous, occasionally paranoid control. He built fortresses not just for protection, but as a message. His soldiers wore matching uniforms, his cities ran on discipline, and his court operated like a finely tuned machine. People called him the Iron Duke, though never to his face. But beneath that steel exterior, Cosimo was also a lover of beauty. Because, Well, he was still a Medici. He patronized artists like Bronzino, who painted everyone to look like marble statues, pale and perfect and ever so slightly dead inside. He hired Vasari, the world's most flattering historian, to les white lives of the artists, basically an early version of greatest hits of the Renaissance, with the Medici cast as eternal heroes. He expanded the Uffizi not as a museum that came later, but as government offices. The fact that it later became one of the most famous art galleries in the world is just a very Medici coincidence. They never could keep business and beauty apart. Cosimo was also the first Medici to be officially called Grand Duke of Tuscany, a promotion from mere Duke of Florence, granted by the Pope himself. You could almost hear the family ancestors applauding from their tombs. From bankers to popes to dukes to grand dukes. Not bad for a clan that started out counting coins in wool warehouses. But Cosimo's story wasn't just triumph and marble. It was also exhaustion. The endless work of building power took its toll. In his later years, he became reclusive, retreating to his villa in Casino. He spent his days gardening and staring at fountains, maybe wondering if all that control had been worth it. When he died in 1574, Florence didn't erupt in mourning the way it once had for Lorenzo. It just sighed and carried on. Then came his sons. And oh, the sons! Cosimo had 11 children, but the two who mattered most, at least politically, were Francesco I and Ferdinand I. The brothers could not have been more different. Francesco inherited the title, the palaces, and, unfortunately, his father's paranoia without any of the discipline. He was moody, secretive, and obsessed with alchemy. Not the fun, poetic kind. The real, sweaty kind, where grown men spent hours boiling mercury and convincing themselves they were about to turn it into gold. He filled his private study with strange apparatuses, jars of powders, preserved animals, and things best left unnamed. He also had relationship problems, which, in this family, was basically tradition. Francesco's marriage to Joanna of Austria was a cold diplomatic arrangement. She was pious, humorless, and constantly homesick. He, on the other hand, fell in love with Bianca Capello, a Venetian noblewoman with a past just scandalous enough to make Florence whisper for decades. Bianca had run away from home as a teenager and married for love, which was considered highly suspicious behavior in the 16th century. She met Francesco. They fell for each other, and soon she was his mistress, and later, his wife. The city hated her. She was seen as an outsider, manipulative, maybe even cursed. But Francesco didn't care. He built her a palace, dined with her every night, and ignored everyone else. It was like a Gothic romance that somehow got lost and wandered into Renaissance politics. Their story, predictably, ended badly. In 1587, both Francesco and Bianca died suddenly, within hours of each other. Officially, it was malaria. Unofficially, everyone assumed poison. Some said Francesco's brother, Ferdinando, had arranged it, clearing the way for himself to take the throne. Others said the lovers accidentally poisoned each other while experimenting with alchemical concoctions. Either way, it was the kind of melodramatic ending that fit the family perfectly. Ferdinando Tocovaran tu is credit actually ruled pretty well. He was a cardinal before becoming duke, which gave him a kind of moral sheen, or at least good PR. He strengthened trade, improved the navy, built new towns, and generally behaved like someone trying to clean up the family name. Under him, Tuscany regained a bit of dignity. But then came the next generation, and dignity once again packed its bags. The Medici of the 1600s were rich, bored, and increasingly fragile, physically and emotionally. Generations of inbreeding had begun to show. Their portraits from this period look beautiful but strangely stiff, as if the painters were working very hard to disguise the fact that half their subjects had the same jawline and haunted eyes. The women, in particular, carried the burden of appearances. They were expected to marry well, smile politely, and pretend not to notice the decaying grandeur around them. One of the more famous Medici women of this era was Maria de Medici, daughter of Ferdinando's brother. She married the French King Henry IV, An alliance that looked impressive on paper. Maria was clever and ambitious, but also spectacularly unlucky. Her husband was assassinated, her son became Louis XIII, and she spent much of her life fighting her own court for respect. France saw her as the foreign interloper, with too much money and not enough subtlety. Basically, the eternal Medici problem. Back in Florence, the line continued, sort of. Each new Medici Grand Duke seemed weaker, more isolated, more detached from the world outside their palaces. The city was changing. Europe was changing. The Renaissance was a memory, and the Enlightenment was on the horizon. But the Medici still lived as if they were trapped in a painted ceiling fresco, elegant, timeless, and completely removed from reality. By the time we reach Cosimo III, things have gone from mildly decadent to fully depressing. He ruled for nearly 60 years, which sounds impressive until you realize almost no one enjoyed it. He was pious to the point of suffocation, banning fun, controlling behavior, and lecturing everyone about morality. His court was a joyless museum of guilt. His wife, Marguerite Louise d'Orléans, despised him and fled back to France, refusing to return. His children were a disaster. One scandalous, one sickly, one simply uninterested in continuing the family line. The dynasty that had once filled Florence with life and light was now limping toward extinction, weighed down by centuries of its own legacy. In 1737, the last Medici ruler, Gian Gaston de' Medici, died. He was 56, childless, and utterly exhausted by existence. The man had seen too much decay, too much pretense, and too little love. He spent most of his reign hiding in his chambers, surrounded by a few loyal servants, while Tuscany quietly slipped into the hands of the Austrian Habsburgs. And just like that, after almost 400 years, the Medici line was over. No grand rebellion, no spectacular fall, just silence, a slow fade-out, like candlelight flickering to smoke in an empty hall. But their ghosts stayed always door. You can still feel them in Florence, in the soft echo of footsteps through the Uffizi, in the shadowed corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio, in the way sunlight hits the Duomo that Cosimo helped build. Every painting, every dome, every marble arch is a whisper of their obsession with beauty and control. The Medici changed Europe not through conquest, but through culture. They bankrolled genius, they sculpted history, and they left behind a city that still glows centuries later. And maybe that, as the strangest part of all, a family built on money and manipulation somehow ended up giving the world its greatest art. It's ironic, poetic, and very, very Florentine. So, if you're still awake, or somewhere pleasantly drifting between dreams, remember this: the Renaissance wasn't born in cathedrals or battlefields. It was born in the quiet ambitions of people who wanted their names to last forever. And in that, the Medici succeeded completely. Because even when their bloodline ended, their story refused to. And tonight, as the last echoes of their world fade into sleep, Florence still belongs to them. The bankers who built the Renaissance, the family who turned gold into beauty, and the dreamers who taught the world how to shine.